Story 1. Forest Kept Him. There is a stretch of woods in Clearfield County, Pennsylvania, where the trees grow so dense and so tall that sunlight dies before it ever reaches the ground. Locals do not talk about what lives in those woods. They do not talk about the hunter who walked in 3 years ago and never came back out. They do not talk about the rifle that search teams found leaning perfectly, carefully, almost lovingly against a pine tree, as if the man had simply decided to set it down and rest for a moment. No footprints leading away, no signs of struggle, no body, no trail, nothing but silence and that rifle standing there like a grave marker in the dark. I know about those woods because I spent 4 of the most terrifying, haunting, disturbing nights of my entire life inside them. And I am still not sure I made it out completely. Not all of me, anyway. My name is David Marsh. I am 51 years old. I drive a 12-year-old pickup, and until 3 years ago I thought I was the kind of man who did not scare easily. I was a deer hunter. Had been since I was 14 years old, and my father first took me out before sunrise with 2 thermoses of black coffee and a patience that I never fully inherited. I knew forests. I knew how they breathed in the early morning, how they creaked and settled at night like an old house, how the darkness between the trees was just darkness. Nothing more. I had spent hundreds of nights outdoors. I thought I understood the wild. I was wrong. Whatever is in those Clearfield County woods is not wild in any way I had ever understood the word. It started the way every terrifying story starts. Quietly, ordinarily. A long weekend in late October, a buddy who canceled last minute, a campsite I had scouted 2 summers earlier and never returned to. I drove up alone on a Thursday afternoon, the sky already turning that eerie flat gray that Pennsylvania gets in the fall, like the whole atmosphere is holding its breath. I parked off an old logging road, packed my gear, and hiked in about 2 miles before setting up camp near a dry creek bed I remembered from before. The air smelled like cold pine and wet earth. Woodpeckers hammered somewhere in the canopy. A squirrel crossed the trail ahead of me and disappeared into the brush. Everything felt normal. Everything felt exactly the way a forest is supposed to feel. The first night was fine. Cold, quiet, unremarkable. I built a fire, ate a decent meal, listened to the trees, and slept reasonably well inside my tent. If there was anything strange about that night, I did not notice it then. Only later, looking back, did I remember the silence, not the natural silence of a forest at 2 in the morning. Something heavier, something that did not have any of the small ambient sounds a living forest is supposed to have. No insects, no wind movement in the upper branches, no distant highway noise bleeding through the trees, just a silence so complete and so thick that it felt like a physical substance pressing against the walls of my tent. I thought nothing of it. The second morning I hiked deeper in, northeast, following a ridge line I had identified on a topographic map. The forest here was older. The trees were enormous and grew close together, their roots knotting up out of the ground in dark, tangled shapes that caught my ankles twice before I started watching my feet more carefully. The light changed the further in I went. It did not exactly get darker, but it got thinner, like the air itself was being diluted. I stopped around midday to eat and check my compass. That was when I noticed the first thing. A sound. Not a scary sound by itself, just a sound that did not belong. A low, rhythmic knocking, like someone tapping a hollow log with a stick. Slow and deliberate. 3 beats, a pause. 3 beats, a pause. It came from somewhere to the north. I stood still and listened for almost 2 full minutes. Then it stopped, clean, as if someone had flipped a switch. The silence that followed felt different from the silence before it. More aware, more deliberate. I told myself it was a woodpecker. I told myself it was a branch hitting another branch in some small wind I could not feel down where I was standing. I told myself the 100 comfortable things a rational person tells himself in the woods when something does not quite sit right. I started walking again, but I noticed that I was walking a little faster. That afternoon I found the first marker. That is what I've come to call it. A marker. I found it nailed to the side of a large oak tree about 30 yards off the ridge line, and the moment I saw it my stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with any reasonable, nameable fear. It was a piece of wood, roughly rectangular, maybe 10 inches long and 4 inches wide, stripped of its bark and sanded smooth. Someone had carved into it with something sharp. Not letters, not numbers, a pattern of intersecting lines and curves that did not look random but that I could not make any sense of. The wood was old. The carving was old. The nail holding it to the tree had been there long enough that the oak had grown partway around it, swallowing it slowly into itself. This had been here for years. Decades maybe. I photographed it with my phone and walked on. I found 3 more before sunset, each one nailed to a different tree, each one carved with a different version of the same basic pattern, as if someone was making a series of related but distinct statements in a language I did not have the alphabet for. The last one I found was different from the others. It was newer. The wood was lighter in color, not yet weathered to gray. The carving was deeper and more precise. And below the carved pattern, someone had drawn a shape in what looked like black marker. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. When I did understand, every hair on my body stood up and my mouth went dry, and I felt the first true wave of eerie, cold terror move through me like a current. It was a person, a crude drawing, barely more than a stick figure, but unmistakably human. The figure was standing with its arms at its sides. Its head was tilted at an angle that no healthy neck produces. And it was drawn inside a circle, a single continuous line surrounding it completely. I took a photograph and walked back to camp faster than I had any dignified reason to. That night the knocking came back, closer this time. I was inside my tent with my rifle across my lap. The fire burned down to orange coals, and the knocking started somewhere within maybe 100 yards to the north. 3 beats, a pause. 3 beats, a pause. I sat absolutely still. My heartbeat was the loudest thing I could hear between the beats. I counted the intervals, exactly 4 seconds between each set of 3. 4 seconds. Every single time. Perfectly consistent. Mechanically consistent. Nothing biological is that consistent. Not a bird. Not an animal. Not any natural sound source I could name. I sat with that rifle across my lap and I did not sleep. When morning came and gray light filtered through the trees, I was exhausted and cold and embarrassed by my own fear. I walked the perimeter around my camp in the pale early light and found nothing. No tracks, no evidence of anything. The forest in the morning looked ordinary, even slightly beautiful in its cold gray way. I made coffee and told myself I was a 51-year-old man who had scared himself with a noise in the woods and a few old carvings left by someone who probably thought they were being very mysterious sometime back in the 1980s. I told myself the night makes everything feel more dangerous than it is. I told myself I would spend one more day and then drive home. I did not drive home. The reason I did not drive home was the photograph. I was scrolling through the pictures I had taken the day before, wanting to show my son the carved markers when I got back, wanting to have something to prove that the strange eerie feeling of the day had been based on something real and not just middle-aged nerves. I scrolled past the first marker, the second, the third. Then I got to the photograph of the fourth marker, the newer one with the crude human figure drawn in the circle. I zoomed in to look at the figure more closely, and I saw something in the photograph that I had not seen with my own eyes when I was standing in front of it. Behind the figure inside the circle, visible in the background of the carved surface, were smaller marks I had not noticed. Not carved, scratched, like fingernail scratches. They spelled out 2 words. I stared at the screen of my phone for a long time. The 2 words were, I waited. I do not have a clear explanation for why those 2 words kept me in those woods instead of sending me running for my truck. Maybe it was the old hunting stubbornness in me. The part that once sat motionless in a deer stand for 9 hours in 20-degree weather because I had decided I was going to see something. Maybe it was something else. Something that I am not entirely comfortable examining too closely. Whatever the reason, I stayed. I packed my camp more carefully that morning and moved it roughly a quarter-mile south, closer to the logging road, which felt like a reasonable compromise between running and staying. Then I went back to look at the marker again in daylight, and that is when I found the 5th marker. I had missed it the night before. It was on the opposite side of the same oak tree, facing north. This one was carved with the same pattern as the others, but in the center of the pattern, carved deep, was a single letter. The letter or nothing else. The afternoon was the worst stretch of time I have ever experienced outdoors. Nothing happened. That is what made it so terrifying and so psychologically unbearable. I walked. I looked. The forest was exactly as it should be. The light came through the canopy exactly as it should. Animals moved in the underbrush. A red-tailed hawk circled high above a clearing to my east. Everything was ordinary and peaceful and fine. But the feeling that had settled over me was not ordinary, and it was not peaceful, and it was the furthest thing from fine. It was the feeling of being watched. Not glanced at, watched. The way you feel in a dream when you know something is in the room behind you, but you cannot turn around to see it. A persistent, creeping, eerie awareness that the space between the trees was not empty even when my eyes told me what. I stopped every few minutes and stood motionless and listened. The forest sounded normal, but the feeling did not go away. If anything, it grew heavier as the afternoon wore on, like a pressure building behind the trees, like the darkness between the trunks was slowly filling up with something that did not have a shape I could point to. Then I found him, not the man who walked in and never came out, not the missing hunter. What I found was older than that, much older. I found him at the bottom of a shallow ravine I had not seen on my map, maybe 3/4 of a mile northeast of my new camp. He was sitting with his back against a large rock, or what remained of him was. He had been there a long time, decades at minimum, possibly longer. He was wearing clothes that had rotted to almost nothing, but the shape of him was still recognizable. He was sitting upright, his hands resting in his lap, his head tilted at an angle that matched the figure in the drawing exactly, that angle no healthy neck should produce. His rifle was there, leaning against the rock beside him, set down carefully, almost lovingly. I took one photograph and then I backed away from that ravine as quietly and as carefully as I have ever moved in my life. And I walked south without running because something deep in my brain told me that running would be the wrong choice, that running would change my relationship to whatever was in those woods in a way that would not be in my favor. I was 200 yards from my camp when the knocking started again. Not from the north this time, from every direction at once. 3 beats, a pause. 3 beats, a pause. I kept walking. My hands were shaking and my vision had narrowed to a tunnel focused on the orange color of my tent between the trees ahead of me. The knocking followed me, stayed the same distance away no matter how fast I walked. When I reached my tent, I took it down in under 3 minutes, packed everything into my bag with the methodical efficiency of a man who understood that thinking too much about what he had just seen would result in him not being able to move at all, and I started down the logging road toward my truck. The knocking stopped when I reached the road. I drove 4 hours without stopping. I called my son from a gas station outside of Clarion and told him I had cut the trip short because of weather. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was fine. He said I did not sound fine. I told him again that I was fine and I asked him how work was going and we talked for 15 minutes about ordinary things and the whole time I was watching the tree line across the highway, watching the darkness between the trunks, watching for 3 knocks. The following spring, a hunter from Dubois entered those same Clearfield County woods and never came back out. His rifle was found leaning against a tree near a dry creek bed. Search teams spent 8 days in those woods. They found no trail, no signs of struggle, no body. I read the news report 3 times. The dry creek bed, that was where I had made my first camp. That was exactly where I had spent my first night. The night when the silence was too heavy and too complete and I had told myself it was nothing. I have not been back. I will not go back. But there is a photograph on my phone that I cannot bring myself to delete. The photograph of the 5th marker with the single carved letter R. And sometimes late at night when the house is quiet, I zoom in on that photograph and I think about what that letter means. A name, maybe, an initial, a warning, a signature. Sometimes I think it stands for something I do not have a word for yet, something old and patient and deeply, horrifyingly unhurried. Something that has been in those Clearfield County woods far longer than any of us have been in this country. Something that knows how to wait. Something that waited for the man at the bottom of the ravine. Something that waited for the hunter from Dubois. Something that, if my instincts are even remotely correct, is not finished waiting. I set my rifle down in the woods once, just for a moment, to free up my hands while I was packing my tent. I set it against a pine tree and I picked it back up again 30 seconds later. But I think about those 30 seconds more than I can easily explain. I think about how natural it felt to set it down. How the cold air and the silence and the particular quality of the darkness between those trees made the act of putting down the one thing I had to defend myself feel like the most sensible, most restful, most logical thing in the world. Like something I had been meaning to do for a very long time. Like something that had been patiently waiting for me to realize I wanted to do it. I picked the rifle back up. I walked out. I am telling you this story, but I remember how good it felt, for those 30 seconds, to simply let go. I hope you remember that part. I hope you remember it the next time someone tells you that the forest is just a forest. That there is nothing in the dark between the trees. That the silence is just silence. That the knocking is just the wind. I believed all of those things once. I was a practical man with a 12-year-old truck and 37 years of hunting experience and not a superstitious bone in my body. And then I spent 4 nights in Clearfield County, and I found a man who had been sitting against a rock for 50 years with his rifle set carefully beside him. And I felt, in the marrow of my bones, the terrifying and chilling and deeply disturbing truth that the forest in Clearfield County does not take people. It does not hunt them. It does not chase them. It simply waits. It waits with a patience that is so absolute and so complete and so utterly inhuman that it makes the darkness feel like a living thing. And eventually, in their own time, people put down their rifles and sit down and rest for just a moment. And the forest keeps them. The way it kept the man by the rock. The way it kept the hunter from Dubois. The way it almost kept me. The way it is still, right now, tonight, keeping someone I will never know. 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats, a pause, and somewhere in those woods, a rifle is leaning against a tree, waiting to be found. Story 2. Vanished on Route 44, Pennsylvania, a silent stretch. There is a stretch of road in rural Pennsylvania where the trees grow so close to the asphalt that their branches reach across and touch each other overhead, forming a tunnel of darkness so complete that your headlights seem to die before they can show you what lies ahead. I have driven that road. I have seen what waits inside that darkness. And I need to tell you what happened to me on Route 44, because I am starting to believe that if I do not say it out loud, if I do not confess every terrifying detail, something is going to come back and finish what it started. My name is not important. What is important is that I am a normal man. I am in my 40s. I have a pickup truck. I have a house with a mortgage. And I have driven long stretches of lonely highway my entire adult life without once feeling genuine fear. I want you to understand that before anything else. I want you to understand that I am not someone who scares easily, because what I am about to describe will sound like the kind of thing a frightened person imagines in the dark. It is not imagined. Every horrifying detail I am about to share with you is real, and the fact that it happened to an ordinary man on a road he had driven 100 times before is the most disturbing part of all. It was late October, a Tuesday, when I took Route 44 for what I thought would be the last time that season. The drive between my brother's place outside Coudersport and my home in Williamsport covers a long section of that road, roughly 50 miles of isolated 2-lane highway cutting through the At.Eleven State Forest. I had made that drive so many times I could almost do it in my sleep. The tree line, the shallow curves, the occasional deer frozen in the beam of my headlights, the total and complete absence of other human beings once the sun goes down. I knew that road, or I thought I did. I left my brother's place at 8:30 in the evening. The temperature had dropped sharply, and there was a low mist sitting in the valleys between the hills, the kind of eerie ground fog that catches your headlights and turns them back at you in ghostly sheets. I remember thinking it was beautiful in a dark, unsettling way. I remember turning the radio up because the quiet outside felt heavier than usual, almost suffocating. I remember glancing at the clock on the dashboard and seeing 9:04 p.m. glowing green in the darkness of the cab. I never made it home. What I mean by that is not what you were probably thinking. I did not die. I am here, telling you this story. But there is a gap in that night, a missing section of time and memory that still terrifies me every single time I try to examine it. And in that gap, something happened that I cannot explain and cannot escape. Something that left marks on me that no doctor has been able to account for and no rational explanation has been able to touch. Let me tell you what I remember. Around the 9 o'clock hour, I was deep into the silent stretch, the section of Route 44 that locals rarely talk about and visitors do not know to fear. The trees on both sides are enormous there, old-growth timber that has never been cleared. And they press against the road with an intimacy that feels intentional, almost aggressive. My headlights were cutting about 30 feet into the dark ahead of me, and I was doing 50, comfortable, relaxed, thinking about nothing more frightening than whether I had left the garage light on. Then I felt it, not heard, felt, a vibration that started in the steering wheel and traveled up through my hands and into my chest, low and rhythmic, like a massive engine idling somewhere beneath the road itself. I eased off the gas. The vibration continued. I slowed to 30. Still there, I checked my tires by feel, expecting the shimmy of a flat, but the truck was tracking straight and smooth. The vibration was coming from outside, from the ground, from everywhere and nowhere at once, and as I became more focused on it, I realized it was not random. It had a pattern. It was cycling, repeating, almost like breathing. I pulled to the shoulder. I know now that this was a mistake. The truck sat on the gravel edge of the road with the engine running, and the moment I stopped moving, the vibration intensified. I could feel it in my teeth. I looked out through the windshield and into the trees, and I saw nothing, which was somehow worse than seeing something. The darkness between the trunks was absolute. No moonlight filtered through the canopy. No animal eyes caught my headlights and glowed back at me. Nothing moved. The forest was as still as a photograph. And the silence around that deep rhythmic vibration was the kind of silence that feels manufactured. the kind that tells you something nearby has made a deliberate choice to stop making noise. I reached for my phone. 9:17 p.m., full signal. I started to dial my brother and then I stopped. And I have thought about why I stopped every day since, and I still do not have a satisfying answer. Something told me not to. Not a voice, not a feeling exactly, more like a pressure behind my eyes. A sudden and overwhelming certainty that making a sound, any sound at all, would be catastrophic. So I sat there, holding my phone, watching the dark between the trees. And that was the last clear thing I remember. The next thing I know, I am standing outside the truck. I am standing on the center line of Route 44 facing away from my vehicle, and I am looking down the road into absolute darkness, and I do not know how I got there. The truck is behind me, still running, headlights on, door open. I am in my socks. My boots are on the floor of the cab. My jacket is folded on the hood of the truck with a neatness that I would never do under any normal circumstances. The mist has thickened dramatically, and now it is sitting at waist height across the entire road, and I am standing in it like something emerging from a nightmare swamp. My phone is gone. My hands are cold in a way that feels deeper than weather, like the cold has come from inside my bones rather than from the October air. And the vibration is gone. The silence that replaces it is the most terrifying thing I have ever experienced. Not peaceful silence, predatory silence, the silence of a held breath. I turned around slowly. I want to be clear about what I saw and what I did not see, because every instinct I had in that moment was telling me to get into the truck and drive and never come back, and the only reason I did not is that my body did not seem to be entirely my own. I moved toward the truck the way you move in a dream, with effort that produces almost no speed, my feet finding the asphalt with a carefulness I did not consciously choose. I got to the open door. I looked at the seat. There was soil on the passenger seat. Dark, rich, forest soil, spread across the vinyl in a shape that was almost but not quite random. Almost but not quite a handprint. The kind of almost that makes the hair on the back of your neck rise before your brain has decided whether to be scared. I got in. I closed the door. I put the truck in drive and I left at a speed that I am not proud of, and I drove the remaining 22 miles to Williamsport without touching the brakes once. My wife found me sitting in the driveway at 12:40 a.m. She had been calling my phone for 2 hours. The drive from that point on Route 44 to our driveway is 40 minutes at most. I was sitting with my hands on the wheel and the engine off and the headlights still burning, and when she knocked on the window I did not recognize her face for a full and horrifying 3 seconds. She said my eyes looked wrong. She said they looked like I was looking at something that was not in the driveway with us. She asked me what happened and I told her I did not know. And that was true in a way that scared me more than any lie could have. I went back the next morning. I am aware that this sounds like a horror movie mistake, and I made it anyway, because I am a practical man and I needed to see the road in daylight and prove to myself that there was a rational explanation for the missing time, for the soil on my seat, for standing on the center line in my socks at some point between 9:17 and midnight. I needed the daylight to take the nightmare out of it. Daylight did not help. I found the spot where I had pulled over. The gravel on the shoulder held tire tracks clearly, and they were mine. What was alongside them in the soft earth at the tree line was not. There were impressions in the dark soil at the edge of the forest, depressions that could charitably be called footprints, except that charitably is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. They were roughly the right shape. Roughly. The proportions were wrong in ways that I cataloged and then stopped cataloging because the process of cataloging them was making me feel things I could not afford to feel on the shoulder of that road alone. Longer than a human foot, narrower at the heel, and spaced in a pattern that suggested either an extremely unusual gait or a number of limbs I was not prepared to contemplate. They led from the tree line to the shoulder and then they stopped. I drove home. I did not tell my wife what I had found. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time and I thought about the nature of what I was dealing with, and the more I thought about it, the more a specific and chilling detail began to surface. The phone activity. My last call attempt had been at 9:17. And I remember that clearly because I saw the clock just before I made the decision not to call. But between 9:17 and whenever I arrived home after midnight, there was nothing on my phone record because my phone was gone, somewhere in the forest or somewhere else entirely. In the absence of that data, that 3-hour silence in my digital existence, was the thing that the state police noted when a report was finally filed. I filed that report because I found out I was not the first. A man from Gailton had a nearly identical experience 2 years before mine. Same stretch of road, same approximate time of night, same missing hours, his truck found on the shoulder with the keys in the ignition. He was recovered. He was alive, But he was found standing in a field 4 miles from the road with no memory of leaving his vehicle and no explanation for how he crossed 4 miles of dense forest at night without a scratch on him, without his shoes. The local coverage was minimal. Rural Pennsylvania keeps its secrets the way those trees keep the light, completely and without apology. There was a third case I found later, a woman who had driven Route 44 on a November night and lost 5 hours and woke up in her car in a state forest access road with soil on her hands and a pattern scratched into the inside of her windshield that she did not remember making. She had scratched it with her keys. It was a shape, a recurring shape, a series of nested curves that looked almost like a map of something, or a symbol in a language that no one she showed it to could identify. She had it photographed and then she had her windshield replaced because she could not drive without looking at it. And looking at it made her feel the vibration again even when she was nowhere near Route 44. I understand that feeling. I feel it sometimes at night, in bed, in the quiet of my house. A low rhythmic pulse that starts in my chest and moves outward and makes me certain, absolutely and horribly certain, that something is aware of me. Not watching me in the way a person watches a person, more the way a hunter is aware of the perimeter of a territory. The way something marks what it has already touched and continues to feel the edges of that mark across whatever distance separates us. There is a detail I have not shared with anyone except you. When I was standing on the center line, before I turned around, before I went back to the truck, I was looking down the road into the dark. And in the dark at the very edge of where my headlights reached, something was standing. I did not process it consciously at the time. I think my mind made the choice not to process it. Made the decision that acknowledging it fully is incompatible with continued functioning. But I have seen it in the weeks since, in the space between sleep and waking, with the clarity that that threshold sometimes provides. It was tall, it was very still, and it was looking back at me with an attentiveness that communicated, without any ambiguity, that it knew exactly who I was and had been expecting me for a long time. Route 44 still runs through the At.Eleven State Forest. Trucks still take it at night because it shaves time off the run between the northern counties and the interstate. Men in their 40s with mortgages and garages and perfectly ordinary lives still drive that road in October with the radio up and no expectation of fear. I think about those men. I think about the vibration finding them, the silence surrounding it, the mist at waist height and the soil on the seat, and the question of what exactly happens in the gap between the last phone call and the moment when someone finds them in the driveway not recognizing faces. I think about what it knows, what it has learned from touching so many lives along that dark corridor between the trees. What it wants from us, these ordinary men it selects from the ordinary dark of ordinary Tuesday nights. I have not driven Route 44 again. I will not drive Route 44 again. But sometimes, on quiet nights when my house is settled and the neighborhood is still and there is no wind and no sound at all, I feel the edges of that territory. I feel the mark it left on me the way you feel a scar in cold weather, a deep pull in the tissue that has nothing to do with pain and everything to do with memory. And I know, in the way you know things that bypass reason and live directly in the body, that it is still out there in the silent stretch between those enormous trees, still counting the lights that move through its darkness, still choosing, still patient, still waiting for the particular combination of night and mist and solitude that makes a man pull over on the shoulder and sit very still and decide, for reasons he will never be able to articulate, not to make a sound. Whatever is on Route 44 is not finished. It has never been finished. The road keeps its silence because the silence belongs to something that has been there far longer than the road, far longer than the men who built it, far longer than anyone who has ever driven it and arrived safely on the other side and told themselves the eerie feeling was just the dark and the mist and the hour. Do not drive Route 44 at night. And if you do, and if you feel the vibration, and if the silence wraps itself around you like a held breath in the dark, do not pull over. Do not stop. Do not look down the road at the edge of your headlights. Because if something is standing there looking back at you, it already knows your name. Story 3. 11 seconds. There is a stretch of highway in Pennsylvania where the fog never quite lifts, even in August. I know this because I have driven it more times than I can count, hauling freight across the belly of this country for going on 19 years. I have seen things on the road that most people never see, heard stories at truck stops and diners that would keep a normal person awake for weeks. But nothing, not one single thing in all those years of dark highways and lonely miles, prepared me for what happened outside Harrisburg on a Tuesday night in October. Nothing prepared me for the 11 seconds that changed everything I thought I knew about fear, about darkness, about what waits for us in the spaces between the life we can see and the life we cannot. I want to be careful about how I tell this. I have thought about it every day for 8 months. I have replayed every detail in my mind until the edges were smooth like a stone in a river. And still, when I close my eyes at night, the horror is right there, fresh and alive, as terrifying as the moment it happened. So I'm going to tell you exactly what I saw, exactly what I felt, and I'm going to let you decide what it means. Because I am not sure I can decide anymore. I am not sure deciding is even the right thing to do. My name is Ray Cutler. I am 52 years old. I have a daughter in Columbus, a truck named Margaret after my late mother, and a route that takes me through eastern Pennsylvania at least twice a month. I am not the kind of man who believes in ghost stories. I did not grow up believing in monsters or haunted places or things that go unseen in the dark. I was raised practical, raised skeptical, raised to find the rational explanation before I went chasing the irrational one. That is who I was. Past tense. Because the man writing this now is not the same man who pulled off Interstate 81 on the night of October 14th. The truck stop was called Valley Rest. It sat about 12 miles outside Harrisburg, off an exit marked with one of those faded green signs that look like they have been there since before the highway was even finished. I had stopped there maybe 40 times over the years. It was a nothing kind of place, the kind you find all across this country, a big lot full of rigs, a diner that served coffee thick enough to chew, a fuel station with lights that buzzed and flickered in that unsettling way that always made you feel like the electricity itself was nervous about something. There was a small convenience store attached to the main building, and beyond that, a long corridor that led to the restrooms and a row of phone charger stations that nobody used anymore. It was just past midnight when I pulled in. I had been driving for 7 hours and I needed to use the facilities and get a cup of that terrible coffee and stretch my legs before I pushed through to my delivery in Scranton. The lot was maybe a third full. A dozen rigs lined up along the far fence, a few cars near the diner entrance, the usual quiet hum of a truck stop in the dead middle of the night. There was fog, the kind I mentioned before, the kind that settles into that part of Pennsylvania like it belongs there, like it has always been there and always will be. It softened the lights and made everything look slightly unreal, slightly removed from the ordinary world. I went inside. I bought a coffee and a packet of peanut butter crackers from a young woman at the register who barely looked up from her phone. I walked the long corridor toward the restrooms. The floor was that old linoleum that curls at the edges and makes a faint sound when you step on it, a crinkle, like something living adjusting itself beneath your feet. The lights overhead were the fluorescent kind, and 2 of them were going through that eerie slow pulse that fluorescent tubes do when they are dying, a rhythmic darkening that made the corridor feel like it was breathing. That is when I saw the other man. He was standing at the far end of the corridor, about 30 feet ahead of me, just standing there with his back to me. He was a big man, broad shoulders, wearing a dark canvas jacket and jeans, work boots. A trucker, I assumed. The kind of ordinary, unremarkable figure you see 100 times a night at a place like Valley Rest. He was not moving. He was just standing there, facing the wall where the restroom door was, and there was something about the way he was standing that sent the first small thread of unease through me. He was too still, not the still of a man waiting for something. The still of a man who had forgotten how to move, or who was listening to something I could not hear. I walked toward him. I remember the sound of my boots on that crinkly linoleum. I remember the faint buzz of the dying lights. I remember the way the fog outside pressed against the small window at the end of the corridor, a gray-white pressure against the glass, like something leaning in to watch. I was maybe 15 feet away from him when the lights did something I had never seen lights do before. They did not flicker. They did not buzz louder. They simply went a shade darker, the entire corridor dropping half a tone, like someone had turned a dimmer switch just slightly toward shadow. And in that moment, the man at the end of the corridor turned his head. Not his body, just his head, and not all the way toward me, not enough for me to see his face. Just enough so that the line of his jaw was visible in profile, and I could see that his eyes were open very wide, and that he was not looking at me or at the wall or at anything that was in that corridor. He was looking at something that was not there. I stopped walking. I will not pretend I was not scared. The fear was immediate and specific, not the vague creepiness of a dark road or a strange sound, but the sharp, clean, animal fear of something being wrong in a way that your body understands before your brain does. My heart changed its rhythm. My mouth went dry. I stood there in that corridor with my cheap coffee in my hand, and I watched that man standing at the far end with his head turned at that unnatural angle, and I felt the darkness press in a little closer. Then the lights went out completely for what I would later learn was exactly 11 seconds. 11 seconds of total, absolute darkness in that corridor. Not the comforting darkness of a bedroom at night, where shapes gradually become visible and the world softens into something navigable. This was a different kind of darkness. A chilling, dense, occupied darkness. The kind of darkness that has weight and texture, that presses against your eyes like a physical thing. I could not see my hand in front of my face. I could not see the floor or the walls or the faint outline of the window at the end of the corridor. I was inside the dark the way you are inside a room, surrounded, enclosed, contained. I did not move. I was afraid to move. I listened. And what I heard in those 11 seconds was something I have never been able to fully explain to anyone who was not there. The silence was not empty. Beneath the silence, or maybe within it, there was a sound so low and so strange that I am not sure the word sound even applies. It was more like a pressure change, like the feeling you get when an elevator drops too fast or when a storm front rolls in and the air loses something it had before. My ears popped once, gently, and then there was a smell, brief, sharp, and deeply disturbing, like the inside of a very old building, like stone and rust and something else beneath that, something organic and wrong. The way a dead animal smells after the obvious decay has passed, and all that remains is the deeper, quieter rot that you cannot name. The lights came back. The corridor was empty. He was gone. I stood there for a long moment looking at the empty end of that corridor, at the restroom door that was closed and still, at the small window with its gray fog pressure, and I felt the kind of horror that does not announce itself loudly but settles in slow, like cold water rising. I walked to the restroom door. I pushed it open. I looked inside. 2 stalls, both open, both empty. A row of sinks. A paper towel dispenser with a red low supply light blinking its quiet alarm. No man. No canvas jacket. No work boots. Nobody. I checked behind the stalls. I checked the small cleaning closet at the back of the restroom. I went back into the corridor and I checked every door, the supply room, the back exit, the door marked staff only. All locked. The back exit required a push bar from the inside, and when I pushed it open and looked out into the fog in the night, there was nothing there but the parking lot in the dark and the sound of a distant engine somewhere on the highway. I went back inside. I went to the register and I asked the young woman if she had seen a large man in a dark jacket go past in the last few minutes. She looked up from her phone then, really looked up, and I saw something move in her expression. Not surprise, not confusion, something that looked much more like recognition. She looked at me for a moment and then she looked back down at her phone and she said that she had not seen anyone. She was lying. I have driven trucks for 19 years and before that I spent 4 years reading faces in a warehouse job where half the crew was running some kind of side game, and I know what a lie looks like when it lives behind someone, his eyes. She had seen him. She knew exactly who I was talking about. And she was not going to say one word about it. I did not push her. Something told me not to push her. The same instinct that had stopped me in the corridor, that animal understanding that certain situations have a gravity to them, a pull, and that asking the wrong question is the same as stepping into the pull instead of away from it. I took my coffee and I walked back out to Margaret and I sat in the cab with the engine running and the heater going and I tried to understand what I had just experienced. I pulled out my phone and I searched the name of the truck stop. Valley Rest, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I scrolled through the results looking for nothing in particular, just searching, the way you do when your mind is too rattled to have a specific question. I was 4 or 5 pages into the search results when I found a forum post from 3 years earlier. It was on one of those trucking message boards where drivers talk about routes and conditions and road stories. The post was from a driver whose handle was Penline Holler. The post said that a man had disappeared from Valley Rest in 2019. A long-haul driver, late 40s, who had been captured on the security cameras walking toward the restrooms and had never come out. The cameras had glitched for 11 seconds. The man had never been found. I read that post 4 times in the cold cab of my truck with the heater blowing and the fog pressing against my windows. 11 seconds. The same 11 seconds I had just experienced. The same corridor. The same darkness. And somewhere in that darkness, another human being had stopped existing in the way that human beings are supposed to exist. I drove to Scranton. I made my delivery. I stopped at a rest area on the way back and I slept for 3 hours in the cab, which is something I almost never do because the sleep you get in a truck cab is thin and uneasy, full of the sounds of other rigs coming and going. I dreamed, which I also almost never do, or almost never remember. I dreamed about the corridor at Valley Rest and the darkness and the smell of old stone and deep rot. And in the dream I turned around and looked behind me and the corridor stretched back, impossibly long, into a distance that no building could contain, and along the walls of that impossible distance there were shapes standing very still, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all of them facing the walls with their heads turned slightly to the side, all of them looking at something that was not there. I woke up sweating in 30-degree weather. I have not been back to Valley Rest. I changed my route, added 40 minutes to my trip, and I do not care. I spoke to 2 other drivers over the following months, men who had been running the same stretch of 81 for years. And when I mentioned Valley Rest and the man who disappeared, I got the same thing from both of them. A silence, a look, and then a redirect, a change of subject, the conversational equivalent of a locked door. People who run that road know something, or they suspect something, and they have made a collective decision, conscious or not, that the knowing or the suspecting is not something to talk about out loud. What I believe now, 8 months later, with all the rational skepticism I was raised with pushed up against all of the dark and undeniable things I experienced in that corridor, is this. There are places in this country, ordinary-looking places, highway stops and rest areas and motels and stretches of road, where something is different. Where the ordinary rules that govern the physical world have a thin spot, a place where the fabric wears through. I do not know what is on the other side of that fabric. I do not know if the man in the dark jacket went through it willingly or was taken through it or simply stepped into the wrong place at the wrong moment. I do not know if what I smelled and felt and heard in those 11 seconds was the edge of that other place brushing against the ordinary world, or if it was something else entirely, something that exists in the dark between one state and another, patient and old and completely indifferent to the people who accidentally walk into its range. What I know is that he was there, and then the lights went out, and then he was not there, and the cameras glitched for 11 seconds, and in Pennsylvania, sometimes the cameras do not tell the whole story. The fog on that stretch of 81 never quite lifts. Not even in August. I know this because I still drive it, just not that exit, just not that stop, just not that corridor. But sometimes, late at night, when the fog is thick and the lights on the highway have that eerie distant quality that makes them look more like memories of lights than actual lights, I think about that man and where he went, and I think about the shapes in my dreams standing along that impossible corridor. All of them so patient, all of them so still, and I think about how thin the fabric might be in other places, places I drive through every week without knowing, without any warning, without any way to know that this particular exit, this particular stop, this particular corridor, is the one where the lights will go out for 11 seconds and the darkness will be the kind that has weight and texture and a smell like stone and old rot. And when the lights come back on, I will be the one who is not there anymore. Drive safe out there. Stay on the main roads. And if you ever stop at a place called Valley Rest, outside Harrisburg, in the fog and the dark of a Pennsylvania night, and you see a man at the end of a corridor standing too still, facing the wall, with his head turned at an angle that makes your body understand something your mind has not caught up to yet, do not walk toward him. Do not stand there waiting for the lights to change. Turn around and walk back out into the night air and get into your vehicle and drive until the fog clears and the lights of a city are ahead of you, bright and real and full of the ordinary, unremarkable, terrifyingly beautiful noise of a world where people stay where they are supposed to be, because the 11 seconds come without warning, and once they come, there is no asking where anyone went. There is only the empty corridor, and the still restroom, and the young woman at the register who will not look up from her phone, and the fog at the window pressing in like something that has been waiting there a very, very long time. Story 4. Let the timeline broke. There are cases that haunt investigators for decades. Cases where the evidence does not lie, but the truth still refuses to make sense. What happened in State College, Pennsylvania on a bitter February night is one of those cases. And the more I dug into it, the more I started to feel like I was being watched. Like something about this story did not want to be told. I need you to stay with me here, because what I am about to walk you through is not your typical scary story. There are no monsters hiding under beds. There are no demons crawling out of walls. What makes this terrifying? What makes it the kind of horror that follows you into daylight and sits behind your eyes while you try to sleep? Is how ordinary everything was. A college campus, a dormitory, a young woman stepping outside to take a phone call. The most unremarkable sequence of events imaginable. And then she was gone. Her phone was found 2 blocks away, half buried in a snowbank, screen still lit, the call still technically connected. No signs of struggle anywhere along those 2 blocks. No drag marks in the snow. No scattered belongings. No screaming. No witnesses. Just a phone glowing in the dark like a tiny lighthouse, sending its signal out into an empty, freezing night, and nobody on the other end listening anymore. I have spent a long time thinking about fear. Real fear. Not the kind you get from a jump scare in a movie theater, but the kind that settles into your bones slowly, the kind that makes you rethink everything you assumed was safe. This case gave me that fear. This case made me understand that the most disturbing thing in the world is not a monster. It is a gap, a silence, a timeline that simply does not add up, no matter how many times you run the numbers. Let me take you there. Let me walk you into that night. State College, Pennsylvania sits at the heart of the state like a small bright island surrounded by dark water. It is a college town through and through, the kind of place where everyone feels insulated from the real world because the real world is somewhere else. The campus of Penn State sprawls through the center of it, lit up and loud and full of life even in the dead of winter. Students have always felt safe there. That sense of safety, that comfortable certainty, is part of what makes what happened so deeply, profoundly unsettling. It was the kind of February night that does not apologize for itself. The temperature had dropped into the single digits. The wind came in hard off the surrounding hills and cut through every layer you were wearing. The kind of cold that makes your face ache within 30 seconds of stepping outside. The sidewalks were glazed with ice under a thin skin of new powder, and the streetlights cast everything in that particular shade of orange that makes a winter night feel both beautiful and eerie at the same time. She was a junior, 20 years old. By every account, she was careful, smart, the kind of person who texted her roommate when she was heading out and texted again when she got back. She had grown up in a suburb outside Philadelphia and had been living in the dormitory for 2.5 years without incident. She knew the campus. She knew the area. She was not someone who took unnecessary risks. At 11:47 in the evening, her phone showed an incoming call. Her roommate was already asleep. The dorms in that building had thin walls, and she was considerate enough not to want to wake anyone. So she did what thousands of college students do every single night without thinking about it twice. She put on her coat. She slipped on her shoes. She stepped outside to take the call in the cold. The last confirmed image of her comes from a security camera mounted above the dormitory entrance. The footage shows her walking out the front door at 11:49, phone pressed to her ear, breath misting in the frozen air. She turns left. She walks toward the edge of the parking lot. She moves out of the camera's field of view. After that, the darkness takes her, and the timeline stops making sense. Blank, underscore, blank. Here's what I mean when I say the timeline does not add up. And I want you to really sit with this, because this is where the horror begins. Not the screaming kind of horror. The quiet, creeping, nauseating kind. The call she received at 11:47 lasted for 6 minutes according to the phone records. 6 minutes. That means if everything was normal, the call would have ended at 11:53. A 6-minute conversation in sub-zero temperatures. Long enough to feel cold, but not long enough to panic. She would have been standing outside for maybe 8 minutes total before turning around and walking back inside. The phone was found at 12:17 in the morning. A student returning from the library spotted the glow in the snowbank and picked it up. He recognized it because of the case on it, a specific kind of custom case he had seen her carrying. He went inside and knocked on the roommate's door. The roommate woke up. She called her friend his phone, watched it light up in the student's hand, and the horror of what that meant took about 4 seconds to arrive. 24 minutes. That is the gap. The call ended at 11:53. The phone was found at 12:17. 24 minutes during which a young woman was present enough to either lose or place her phone in a snowbank 2 full blocks from her dormitory, and then absent enough to leave no footprints, no trail, no sign, no sound. 2 blocks, in a storm, in the middle of the night, without her phone, without her ID, without her wallet, without a word to anyone. I have walked that stretch of sidewalk. I went there in daylight, in the kind of gray February cold that makes Pennsylvania feel like the loneliest place on earth. 2 blocks does not sound like much until you are standing there trying to understand how a person covers that distance without being seen, without leaving evidence, without drawing attention from a single human being on a college campus that never fully sleeps. The distance felt enormous to me. It felt like the edge of something. The investigation moved quickly at first, the way these things always do when hope is still a reasonable emotion. Campus security pulled every camera feed they had. Local police brought in dogs. Friends and classmates organized search parties that fanned out through the surrounding neighborhood and into the wooded areas beyond the edges of campus. The National Weather Service confirmed that no significant snowfall had occurred between midnight and the time the phone was discovered, which meant that any tracks made in that window should have still been visible. There were no tracks. This is the detail that made me feel something cold move through my chest the first time I read it. There were no tracks. Not in the snow around the phone. Not in the snowbank itself. Not on the sidewalk leading to the spot where the phone was found. It was as though the phone had been placed there not by a person walking through snow but by something that did not touch the ground. I know what you were probably thinking. I thought it too. Somebody else moved the phone. Somebody found it, panicked, dropped it in the snow, walked away. The timeline is not about her at all. The phone simply got separated from her somehow and ended up there through a chain of events we have not yet pieced together. Except that is not what the data says. The temperature of the phone when it was recovered was consistent with having been in the snow for somewhere between 15 and 25 minutes. Not an hour, not 3 hours, 15 to 25 minutes, which puts it in that snowbank sometime between 11:52 and 12:02 in the morning. Right when the call was ending. Right when she should have been turning around to go back inside. The timeline says she was there. The snow says she was not. Blank, underscore, blank. There is a particular flavor of fear that I can only describe as existential dread. It is different from being startled, different from being grossed out, different from the adrenaline spike of watching something dangerous happen. Existential dread is slow. It builds in you like water rising in a sealed room. You do not notice it at first. You notice it when you realize the ceiling is much closer than it used to be. The more I learned about this case, the more I felt that dread rising. Because I started finding other pieces. Small things, individually easy to dismiss, but collectively forming a shape I could not look away from. The woman on the other end of the phone call was located and interviewed within 48 hours. She described the conversation as completely normal. They talked about a project, about plans for the weekend, about nothing in particular. Nothing alarming was said. There was no distress in her voice. Toward the end of the call, there was a period of maybe 30 seconds where the line got very quiet, and the woman on the other end assumed her friend had gone briefly inside or shifted away from the wind. Then the call ended. Not abruptly, not with a scream or a crash. It ended the way calls normally end when someone presses the button. 30 seconds of quiet. Someone pressed the button to end the call. I keep returning to that. Someone ended that call deliberately and carefully. Not in a panic, not in a struggle, deliberately. And then the phone ended up in a snowbank 2 blocks from the dormitory. I have a theory about those 30 seconds of quiet. I do not like my theory. I have spent a good deal of time trying to disprove it. I cannot. The neighborhood surrounding that stretch of campus is the kind of place that exists in every college town and barely registers in the daytime. Old houses converted into rentals. Narrow side streets lined with parked cars and overflowing recycling bins. A bar that closes at 2. A 24-hour convenience store with a single employee and a bell above the door. Halfway down the second block, set back slightly from the sidewalk, there is a building that has been vacant for several years. It used to be a small office building, insurance company or something like that. 2 stories, 6 windows across the front, a parking lot on the side overgrown with weeds now frozen solid and poking up through the snow like broken fingers. The ground floor windows are covered from the inside with paper or cardboard. The front door has a padlock on it. When I visited, I stood on the sidewalk across the street from that building for a long time. I am not sure what I was looking at. I am not sure I wanted to find out. Here's what I know. That building is 40 feet from where the phone was found. The police checked it during the initial search. The padlock was undisturbed. The windows showed no signs of forced entry. But the building had a smell. A faint, wrong smell that the investigating officer noted in his report and described, almost apologetically, as difficult to characterize. Organic, like something that had been somewhere dark for a long time. The report moved on quickly after that. One line, one almost embarrassed observation, and then back to documented facts and measured distances. I read that line 4 times. Blank, underscore, blank. The horror of the unknown is different from every other kind of horror because it never resolves. Monster stories resolve. Someone sees the monster, survives or does not survive, and the story ends. The monster was real or it was not real, and either way you have an answer, and an answer, no matter how terrible, is a kind of relief. The unknown does not give you relief. The unknown just keeps expanding, filling the space where answers should be, pressing against the inside of your skull at 2 in the morning when the house is quiet and you cannot remember why you felt safe going to sleep. I am a rational person. I live in a rational world. I believe in evidence and logic and the idea that if you gather enough data, the picture eventually becomes clear. I held on to that belief through a lot of this research. I held on to it past the point where it was comfortable to hold on to. But there's a moment in every truly disturbing story where the rational framework starts to crack. Where the accumulation of strange details reaches a kind of critical mass and the brain, which has been working so hard to find the explanation, suddenly goes quiet. Not because it has found the answer, because it has realized, somewhere deep in its oldest circuits, that some gaps are not meant to be filled. That some darkness exists specifically because something needs it to exist. I had that moment standing across from that building in State College, Pennsylvania, on a gray February afternoon with the cold working its way through my jacket and the street empty in both directions. I had the thought, sudden and completely unbidden, that I was being watched. I turned around. The street behind me was empty. The convenience store was a block and a half away, its sign a smear of red neon in the gray light. A car passed without slowing. A crow landed on a telephone wire above my head, sat there for a moment, and then flew away without making a sound. Nothing was there. I walked back to my car. I drove the highway. I turned the heat up as high as it would go and I kept the radio on loud and I did not stop until I was well clear of Center County and the hills had flattened out around me and I could breathe without that feeling in my chest that something was standing very close behind me. Blank, underscore, blank, she has not been found. I want to be clear about that. This is not a story with a resolution hiding around the corner. This is not a case that was eventually cracked by a determined detective or explained away by a logical reconstruction of events. As of the time I am telling you this story, she has not been found. The investigation remains technically open. Her family continues to hold on to the hope that families in these situations hold on to because there is no alternative to holding on to it. The phone sits in an evidence room somewhere. The security camera footage has been reviewed so many times that the people reviewing it have stopped seeing it and started just watching pixels move. The timeline has been reconstructed and deconstructed and reconstructed again, and it still does not add up, and nobody in any official capacity will say out loud what that means. 24 minutes, 2 blocks, no tracks in the snow, a phone placed in a snowbank with the same careful precision that someone uses when they do not want to be heard. I have told this story to a few people since I came back from State College. People who know me well, people who know I do not scare easily, people who know the difference between sensationalism and genuine unease. Every single one of them had the same reaction. They listened. They asked a few questions. And then they went quiet for a while, the way you go quiet when something has moved into a space in your mind and started rearranging the furniture. One of them said something I have not been able to shake. He said that the most chilling part of the story was not the missing girl or the impossible timeline or the vacant building with its wrong smell. The most terrifying part, he said, was the phone call ending normally. Someone pressing that button. The ordinary, deliberate act of ending a call in the middle of something extraordinary. He said it sounded like something that wanted to appear calm. Something that understood how a normal ending to a phone call should sound and was careful to provide one. I told him that was a disturbing way to think about it. He said he thought that was exactly the right way to think about it. Blank, underscore, blank, I will leave you with this. There is a stretch of sidewalk in State College, Pennsylvania, that I think about more than I probably should. 2 blocks, 40, maybe 50 footsteps for someone walking at a normal pace. Lit on either side by streetlights that turn the snow orange and the shadows deep in the world very, very small. A stretch of sidewalk that a young woman walked down on a February night and somewhere along which the world she knew stopped being the world she was in. The cold is extraordinary there in February. Standing still, it gets into your teeth and behind your eyes and down into the joints of your fingers until the idea of warmth becomes almost theoretical. Something you believe in intellectually but cannot actually feel anymore. A person would not stand out in that cold longer than necessary. A person would want to finish the call and get inside. 6 minutes. That was all the time there was. I do not know what happened in those 6 minutes. I do not know what the 30 seconds of quiet on the phone line contained. I do not know why there were no tracks in the snow or what the organic smell in the vacant building was or why the timeline refuses, no matter how many ways you approach it, to resolve into something a rational mind can accept. What I know is that somewhere between the dormitory entrance and a snowbank 2 blocks away, on a night when the temperature was in the single digits and the streets were empty and the world was exactly as ordinary as it always is, something happened. Something that left no trace except a glowing phone in the snow and a gap in the timeline that nobody has been able to close. And sometimes, late at night, When the house has gone quiet around me and the darkness outside the window is the particular thick darkness of a cold night with no moon, I think about that 30 seconds of quiet on the phone line. I think about how whatever was there was careful enough to end the call properly. And I think about how carefully, how deliberately, how patiently something like that must have been watching, waiting for her to step outside, waiting for the night to be cold enough that no one else would follow. Story 5. Cabin at the end of season. What if 3 men walked into the Pennsylvania woods and simply ceased to exist? No blood, no struggle, no tracks leading away from the door, just silence, and a table still set for dinner, and a fire that had burned itself down to cold ash. That is the story I've been trying to forget for 2 years. That is the story that wakes me up at 3 in the morning with my hands pressed flat against the mattress, listening for sounds in my own house that I cannot explain. I need you to understand something before I go any further. I am not a man who scares easily. I have worked search and rescue in the northern Pennsylvania wilderness for 11 years. I have pulled hunters out of frozen ravines. I have found lost hikers after 4 days in the dark. I have seen things that most people will never see. And I have carried those things home quietly, the way you carry a stone in your shoe that you never quite get around to removing. But nothing in 11 years prepared me for what I found in that cabin. Nothing prepared me for what I felt standing in that doorway, staring at a room that looked completely normal, knowing with absolute certainty that something was deeply, horrifyingly wrong. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning in late October. A rental agency in Tioga County had not been able to reach the 3 men who had booked a hunting cabin for the full 2-week season. They were supposed to check out on a Sunday. They did not. The agency sent a local caretaker to check the property on Monday. The caretaker pulled up, saw the truck still parked outside, knocked on the door, got no answer, and made the call that eventually reached our office. By Tuesday afternoon, I was driving north on Route 6 with my partner Dale, the heater in the truck blowing warm air against the gray October sky, both of us figuring this was going to be a standard welfare check. 3 guys got into the bourbon a little heavy. Maybe one of them had a medical episode. Maybe they drove out in a second vehicle and forgot to notify the agency. That kind of thing happens more than people realize. That kind of thing has a rational explanation. I kept telling myself that the whole drive up, watching the hills go dark with bare trees and low cloud, watching the small towns thin out until there was nothing on either side of the road but forest and the creeping, eerie feeling that the world was slowly being swallowed. The cabin was set back about a quarter mile from a gravel road, accessible by a narrow lane that cut through a stand of old hemlocks. We pulled up just after 4 in the afternoon, and the first thing I noticed was the truck. A dark blue Ford F-250, maybe 4 years old, parked neatly beside the cabin like the owner had just stepped inside for a moment. The tires had not sunk into the mud. That told me it had been there a while, that the ground had dried and reset around the weight of it. The second thing I noticed was the firewood. Someone had stacked a full cord of split logs against the east wall of the cabin, neat and tight and covered with a tarp. Not the work of men who were planning to disappear. That is the kind of thing you do when you intend to come back. Dale knocked. We waited. Dale knocked again and announced our presence in the flat, professional tone that search and rescue people develop over years of delivering bad news in quiet voices. Nothing. I tried the door and it opened without resistance. The lock had not been engaged. Inside, the air was cold but not freezing, which meant heat had been running recently. Within the last day or two at most. The lights were off, but the afternoon gray coming through the windows was enough to see everything clearly. And what I saw stopped me in the doorway in a way that I still cannot fully describe without that chilling sensation crawling up the back of my neck all over again. The beds were made, all 3 of them, in the 2 small bedrooms off the main room, made with the particular tightness of men who had been raised to keep things orderly. Personal gear was arranged on the floor beside each bed, boots lined up, blaze orange vests hanging on the hooks by the door. On the kitchen table there was food, not leftovers, not scraps, but an actual meal in the process of being prepared and then simply abandoned. A cutting board with an onion half chopped, the knife resting flat beside it. A cast iron pan on the stove, cold, with what had been ground beef browned and waiting. A can of crushed tomatoes open on the counter. 3 bowls set out, 3 spoons. It looked like someone had been standing right there making chili and had simply stepped away for a moment and never come back. I stood in that kitchen for a long time, and the disturbing stillness of the scene pressed against me like something physical. This was not a place where something violent had happened. There was no overturned furniture, no sign of struggle, no indication of panic or flight. But there was also no note, No indication of where they had gone, no phones left charging, no wallets on the counter. Dale and I moved through the cabin room by room with flashlights even though we did not need them yet, because flashlights give you something to hold on to when a place makes you feel that particular brand of unsettling fear that you cannot name. The back door was unlocked as well, and it opened onto a narrow wooden deck that overlooked a stretch of meadow leading down to the tree line about 200 yards away. The last of the afternoon light was turning the meadow a deep, haunted gold. I stepped out and looked at the ground. The deck had a fine layer of fallen leaves on it. They were undisturbed. Not a single footprint in the leaves. Not on the deck. Not on the 2 wooden steps leading down to the yard. Not in the soft earth of the yard itself. I circled the cabin twice, examining every possible exit point, and I found the same thing every time. Nothing. No tracks leading away from the building in any direction. Dale said it before I did. He said that what he was looking at did not make any sense. And I agreed with him. And we both stood there in the growing dark, feeling the particular terror that comes not from something jumping out at you, but from something refusing to reveal itself. In horror, the monster that you cannot see is always worse than the one you can. What I was standing inside of was a horror with no visible shape, and that formlessness made it more frightening than anything I had encountered before. We called it in. State police arrived within the hour, and by nightfall the area around the cabin had been taped off and a full search was being organized for first light. I stayed on as a consultant because I knew the terrain, and over the next 3 days I walked hundreds of acres of forest in every direction from that cabin with a team of 15 people and tracking dogs. The dogs picked up scent trails inside the cabin and then lost them completely at the back door. Not fading, not drifting, not leading anywhere. Just ending. The handlers had never seen anything like it. One of them, a woman named Carol who had been working search dogs for 20 years, told me quietly during the second day that her dog was not behaving the way it behaved when a scent trail ran cold. It was behaving the way it behaved when it was scared. There is a difference, she told me, and her voice had a darkness in it that I recognized, the voice of someone describing something they do not want to believe. Pennsylvania authorities worked the case for months. No confirmed tracks leading away from the structure. The official report stated, in language so flat and institutional that it almost obscured how genuinely terrifying that fact was. 3 adult men, experienced hunters who knew these woods, had walked into a rented cabin in the middle of the season and vanished between the moment they started making dinner and the moment they should have been eating it. Cell phone records showed no calls or texts after a Thursday evening, 5 days before the scheduled checkout. The last signal placed all 3 phones inside or immediately adjacent to the cabin. Then nothing. Here's where the story should end if it were a straightforward mystery. 3 missing men. No answers. Case goes cold. But the truth is that my part of this story did not end when the search ended. My part of it began on the 3rd night, when I made a decision that I have never told anyone about officially, that I have only told a handful of people in dark rooms when the conversation drifted into territory that most people avoid, when someone leaned forward and asked what I really thought had happened out there. On the 3rd night of the search, after the rest of the team had gone back to the motel in Wellsboro, I drove back to the cabin alone. I do not have a clean explanation for why I did this. Some part of me felt like the answer was still there, hanging in the air of that place the way smoke hangs after a fire, and that if I could just sit with the silence long enough, it would tell me something. I parked at the end of the lane and walked in with a flashlight and a thermos of coffee and let myself in through the back door, which the state police had relocked but which our team had a key for. The cabin was completely dark and the temperature had dropped hard, and my flashlight made small yellow circles on the walls and floor as I moved through it. I sat down at the kitchen table with my coffee and I turned the flashlight off. I know how that sounds. But sometimes in search and rescue you develop a practice of sitting in silence in a place where someone disappeared and just listening. Because sometimes there is information in a place that only comes forward when you stop imposing yourself on it. I sat there in the dark for a long time, maybe 40 minutes, and the cabin settled around me with the small creaks and groans of old wood and cold air, and I felt the eerie weight of 3 absent presences like a pressure behind my eyes. And then I heard it, not from inside the cabin, from outside, from the direction of the meadow. A sound that I cannot describe with complete accuracy because my brain has never fully agreed on what it was. It was low and rhythmic, and it had a quality to it that I associate with deep woods at night, a quality that is not quite animal and not quite wind and not quite mechanical, but borrows something from all 3. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds and then it stopped, and the silence that came after it was a different quality of silence than the one that had come before. Denser somehow. Charged. the way the air feels before a severe lightning storm. I did not move. I sat very still with my hands flat on the table and my heart doing something loud and irregular in my chest, and I made myself breathe slowly because I had been in enough genuinely dangerous situations to know that panic is the thing that kills you. After 2 or 3 minutes, the sound came again, slightly different this time, slightly closer, with a texture to it that made the hair on my arms stand up through my jacket. I reached slowly for my flashlight. I pointed it at the back window. I turned it on. There was nothing visible in the meadow. The beam reached about 60 feet before the dark absorbed it, and in those 60 feet there was only grass and frost and the far shadow of the tree line. But something had changed in the arrangement of the shadows at the edge of my light, this reach, and I cannot tell you with certainty what I was seeing because I did not stay long enough to find out. What I can tell you is that the fear that moved through me in that moment was not the ordinary fear of the dark or of being alone. It was a deeper fear, an ancient and nightmarish fear that felt biological, that felt like a message from some part of my nervous system that predates language, a signal that said simply and with enormous authority that I was in the presence of something that I was not equipped to understand, and that staying to understand it would cost me something I could not afford to lose. I left. I walked out the front door at a pace that I am not proud of, and I got in my truck and I drove south on Route 6 with both hands tight on the wheel and the radio on loud until the trees thinned out and the lights of a gas station appeared on the left side of the road, and I pulled in and sat under the fluorescent lights for 20 minutes before I trusted myself to drive again. I told no one what I had heard. I wrote in my notes that I had returned to the site for a final walkthrough and found nothing new, which was technically true if you were willing to be very selective about what nothing meant. The case was never solved. The 3 men were eventually declared legally dead after the standard period of absence, and their families received the kind of quiet closure that is not really closure at all but just the official acknowledgement that hope has a time limit. I attended one of the memorial services for a man named Gerald Hauser from Erie who had been coming to that cabin every fall for 8 years. His wife spoke about how much he loved the Pennsylvania forests, how the autumn was his favorite season, how he always said there was nowhere on earth more beautiful than the northern woods in October. She said this with a steadiness that I found devastating, the steadiness of a person who has had to make peace with a mystery that will never be resolved. I have spent 2 years trying to construct a rational explanation for what happened in that cabin, and I have not been able to do it. I have read every case file. I have talked to the state police investigators off the record. I have driven back up Route 6 3 times and sat in the parking lot of a diner in Wellsboro and thought about driving out to that gravel road and walking down that lane one more time. And each time I have ordered another cup of coffee and driven home instead. Because here's the thing that really haunts me, the thing that lives at the center of this story and refuses to be dislodged by reason or time or the ordinary comfort of daylight. It is not what happened to those 3 men that keeps me awake. It is the sound I heard from the meadow on that third night, and the quality of the silence that followed it, and the question that I have never been able to answer and that I suspect I was never meant to answer. Because whatever was standing at the edge of that flashlight beam in the frost and the darkness of a northern Pennsylvania October night knew that I was there. And it let me leave. And sometimes, in the particular nightmare that visits me most often, I wake up wondering whether that was mercy, or whether it was patience. Whether something out there in those dark and terrifying woods simply decided that my time had not come yet. That I was being saved for something. That one autumn not too far from now I will drive north on Route 6 with the heater running and the gray sky pressing down on the hills, and I will make a turn onto a gravel road that I recognize. And I will walk down a lane through old hemlocks toward a cabin where everything looks completely normal, and I will understand finally and with absolute certainty why 3 men left their dinner on the table and walked out into the dark and were never seen again. Story 6. Lost near the Appalachian Ridge in Pennsylvania. What would you do if the last words you ever transmitted were received clearly, logged properly, and completely ignored for 6 hours? That is what happened to a surveyor working the Appalachian Ridge in Pennsylvania. And what happened to me when I went looking for answers about his disappearance is something so terrifying, so deeply disturbing, that I have spent the better part of 8 months deciding whether I had the courage to tell anyone at all. I am telling you now because staying silent feels more dangerous than speaking. Because whatever's on that ridge knows I was there, and because the equipment they recovered was not just powered on, it was still recording. I need to back up slightly, but only slightly, because the horror of this story does not need a long runway. It lands on you fast. I am a land surveyor by trade, 41 years old, healthy, experienced, the kind of man who has spent more nights in a tent on a Pennsylvania hillside than in a hotel room. I know the Appalachian Ridge the way a mechanic knows an engine, by feel and sound and smell, and the particular way it misbehaves under pressure. I have worked that terrain in spring mud and October frost in the eerie, suspended quiet of mid-August when the heat sits in the tree canopy like something alive. I am not a man who frightens easily. I am not a man who imagines things. I need you to hold on to both of those facts as I tell you what I found up there, because everything I am about to describe is going to challenge your willingness to believe a practical man. Marcus Hale was a colleague, not a close friend, but a known quantity in our professional world, a careful and methodical surveyor in his mid-50s who had worked the ridge terrain for 2 decades without incident. Last September, he was contracted to map a section of private land abutting state forest near the Appalachian Ridge line in Lycoming County, a remote and largely forgotten stretch of high ground that sits above a valley so isolated that the nearest paved road is 11 miles of switchback gravel away. He radioed his base contact at 3 in the afternoon. The signal was clear. His words were logged. He said he had found something unusual and that he was going to get a closer look. He said he would radio back within the hour. The signal cut out immediately after. They found his equipment 2 days later. Total station, data collector, range poles, all of it arranged at the edge of a small clearing approximately a quarter mile from where his GPS tracker had last pinged. Everything was powered on and functioning. The battery levels were normal. The data collector showed his survey work up to 3:12 p.m. Entries logged with professional precision right up until they simply stopped. No final entry, no error message, no sign of a hurried exit or a dropped instrument. His boots were found beside the equipment, placed parallel to each other with a neatness that the responding team described in their report as arranged, which is a word choice that has haunted me ever since I read it. Marcus was never found. The Pennsylvania State Police conducted a search. Volunteers combed the ridge. Dogs were brought in and gave up at the clearing edge, sitting down and refusing to continue in a way that the search team leader described as the most unsettling thing he had witnessed in 30 years of search and rescue work. The investigation went quiet. The family got no answers. And I, being a stubborn and perhaps catastrophically curious man, decided 6 weeks later to go up there myself. I want to be precise about my intentions because they matter to understanding the nightmare that followed. I was not going up there to investigate the supernatural. I do not believe in the supernatural, or I did not at the time. I was going up there to look at the terrain with a professional eye, to understand what kind of land feature or environmental condition might explain the sudden cessation of Marcus' work, and to satisfy a deeply personal need to do something when the official answer was nothing. I packed for a 3-day trip. I told my wife where I was going. I drove 4 hours north and then another 40 minutes on gravel and parked where the road ended and started walking. The ridge in late October is a specific kind of beautiful that edges right up against Erie. The leaves are mostly down by then and the bare trees create a lattice of dark branches against a pale sky, and the light that gets through is thin and directional and throws long shadows across everything even at midday. Sound carries differently in that stripped-down forest. Footsteps announce themselves. Wind moves through branches with a tone closer to breathing than rustling. Distances become unreliable. I had surveyed similar terrain dozens of times, and I still felt the particular unsettling quality of that ridge pressing against me within the first hour of walking. I found the clearing at 11 in the morning on my first day. I recognized it from the search team photographs, a rough oval of open ground maybe 40 feet across where the tree canopy had been broken, possibly by a blowdown years before, and the undergrowth had not fully reclaimed it. The light in the clearing was different, brighter, almost harsh after the filtered forest light, and stepping into it produced a sensation I can only describe as stepping into a room where a conversation has just stopped. The air felt charged, alert. I stood in the center of the clearing and turned slowly and looked at the tree line surrounding it and felt, with a certainty that bypassed reason entirely, that the tree line was looking back. I set up my own equipment. I took readings. I documented the terrain. I was doing exactly what Marcus had been doing, and a thought sat in the back of my mind with a cold weight that I kept pushing forward and it kept sliding back. Around 1 in the afternoon, I found the first thing. It was at the eastern edge of the clearing where the undergrowth thickened before giving way to mature timber. A series of marks on a large beech tree, horizontal cuts in the bark at roughly chest height, each about 4 inches long, spaced with a consistency that suggested measurement. Not random scoring, not animal marking, deliberate, evenly spaced cuts that someone or something had made with precision, and there were too many of them. I counted 37. They wrapped around the trunk in a spiral pattern that required the counter to walk around the tree to follow, and as I walked around that tree slowly, counting, I noticed that the cuts were not all the same age. Some were old, gray with weathering, bark healed around the edges. Some were newer, the exposed wood still bright. And two of them, at the very end of the spiral, were fresh. Fresh enough that the sap was still moving. I stood there in the chilling October air and felt fear arrive in my body the way it does when your nervous system has processed something your conscious mind is still catching up to. Something had been here recently. Something that measured. Something that marked its counting on living wood and had been doing so for a very long time. I radioed my wife. The signal was good. I described what I had found, calmly, keeping my voice level. She suggested I leave, and I told her I would make camp and continue in the morning because I was a stubborn man and because part of me could not accept that marks on a tree were sufficient reason to abandon the search for answers about Marcus. I set up my tent at the southern edge of the clearing, made a fire, ate, and sat in the darkness watching the tree line and feeling the darkness watch me back. The first night was quiet in a way that was itself deeply disturbing. The Appalachian Ridge at night is never truly quiet. There are owls, there are small mammals moving through leaf litter. There is wind. There is the constant low conversation of a living forest. That night there was nothing. From the moment full dark settled over the clearing to the moment a pale gray light began to separate the tree trunks at dawn, I heard a total of perhaps 4 sounds, all of them unidentifiable, all of them brief, all of them arriving from a direction that seemed to shift each time. The silence was not peaceful. It was attentive. I did not sleep. I sat with my back to a tree and watched the clearing and the fire and felt, with increasing and horrifying clarity, that something outside the firelight was doing the same thing. Watching, measuring, counting. I found the second thing in the morning. During the night, without my hearing any sound of it happening, something had been placed at the edge of the clearing at roughly the 4 points of the compass. Not placed casually, arranged. 4 objects, each one a bundle of sticks bound with what looked like dried grass, each bundle roughly the same size, each one oriented with its longest axis pointing toward the center of the clearing where my fire had been. The bundles were not natural accumulations. They were constructed, and in the gray morning light, with my fire dead and the cold sitting hard on the ridge and the silence continuing its horrifying, suspended completeness, I stood in the center of the clearing and looked at those 4 bundles and understood for the first time in my adult life what it felt like to be truly and completely terrified. Something had come into the clearing while I sat watching. Something that moved without sound on dry October leaves. Something that knew where the cardinal points were. Something that wanted me to know it had been there, had walked the perimeter of my camp, had marked the space I occupied with a precision that felt diagnostic. The way you mark an animal in a trap before you decide what to do with it. I packed my equipment. I did it quickly but not in a panic, because panic on a ridge 11 miles from a paved road is how men die of ordinary causes. And I was trying very hard to focus on ordinary causes. I tried to radio out. The signal was gone. Not low, not static heavy, gone, as completely absent as if the radio itself had been filled with concrete. I checked the battery. Full. I checked the frequency. Correct. I turned it off and on. Nothing. I put it in my pack and started walking and tried to remember that a man who knows terrain can navigate without technology, and I was that man, and I was going to walk out of there and get in my truck and drive home. I walked for 3 hours and arrived back at the clearing. I want to stop here because I need you to understand the specific quality of what I felt in that moment. Standing at the southern edge of the clearing for the second time with 3 hours of determined walking behind me in the morning now fully gone. I had navigated by compass. I had walked downhill consistently, which on that terrain should have brought me to the valley and eventually the road. I had not circled. I had checked my bearing repeatedly. And I was back in the clearing, standing precisely where I had started, looking at the 4 bundles of sticks still pointing toward the center, and my compass was spinning. Not drifting, spinning, the needle rotating in slow continuous circles as if there was no north anymore, as if the concept of direction had been suspended specifically for me on this specific piece of ground. The shadow at the tree line moved. I caught it in my peripheral vision first, the way you catch things at the edge of sight that your brain has to argue with before it admits they are real. A darkness shifting within the darkness of the forest, tall, vertical, moving with a slowness that was more unsettling than speed would have been. I turned to face it directly and it stopped, or it became still, or it became the trees again. I held very still and watched, and the trees were just trees, bare and pale and arranged in the random patterns of natural growth, and the shadow was not there. And then at the absolute edge of my vision, in the gap between 2 large oaks at the northern tree line, Something that was the right height to be a standing human being and the wrong shape to be one was there and then was not. I sat down in the center of the clearing. I know how that sounds. I know the rational response is to move, to do something, to take action. But every direction I could move led either back to the clearing or toward the tree line. And the tree line was where the shadow was. And sitting in the center of an open space in full daylight was the only position that felt remotely survivable. So I got out my data collector out of professional habit and I started logging. Date, time, location based on my last known GPS ping. Observations. I logged everything I've told you so far. I logged it with the same precision Marcus had used, right up until he stopped logging. And then I found what Marcus had found. In my data collector, in the stored files from Marcus Hale, as survey work, there was a file I had not put there and had not known existed. A final entry, timestamp 3:14 p.m. on the day he disappeared, 2 minutes after his last official log entry. It was not a survey measurement. It was a text note, something Marcus had typed into the data collector before he set it down with the equipment they later found. It said that there was a structure in the trees at the northern edge of the clearing, partially buried, old enough that the trees had grown through it and around it and were in the process of absorbing it. It said the structure had markings on every surface he could see, the same type of marks as on the beech tree. Horizontal cuts of consistent length arranged in patterns that he believed were numeric. It said he was going to measure the structure before he radioed back, because the dimensions seemed important and he wanted accurate data. That was the last thing Marcus logged. And the structure was still there. I found it without difficulty, which in itself was frightening. The ease of it, as if it had decided to be found. A collapsed stone foundation, barely knee-high in most places, gray with age and wrapped in root systems from 3 generations of trees. The markings covered every visible stone. Thousands of cuts, the same 4-inch horizontal marks. Densely packed. Some so old they were barely visible and some so recent I could not look at them without feeling the clearing contract around me. In the center of the foundation, where the interior floor would have been, there was a depression in the earth, rough oval, approximately the size and shape of a man lying down. The depression was warm. I ran. I will not describe it as anything more dignified than running. I crashed through the northern tree line in the direction opposite to where I had seen the shadow, moving fast enough that branches took skin off my hands and face. And I ran downhill and did not check my compass and did not stop, and somewhere in the second hour of running I hit gravel and followed gravel to pavement and followed pavement to a gas station and sat on the concrete outside it until my legs stopped working and a woman who worked there brought me water and asked if I needed an ambulance. I drove home. My wife held my hands for a long time at the kitchen table and did not ask me to explain immediately, which is something I will be grateful for until I die. The data collector is in an evidence bag in my home office. The final file from Marcus is on it, documented, photographed, witnessed by my wife and my attorney. The marks on the beech tree are still on that ridge. The foundation is still there. Marcus is still gone. I submitted everything to the state police. A detective called me once, asked a few questions, and I have not heard from him since. The file on Marcus Hale remains open and inactive. The Appalachian Ridge in Lycoming County still draws hikers every fall. People who park at the end of gravel roads and walk uphill into that particular and specific darkness with no idea what is there and no way to know what it does with the time it has and the marks it makes and the warm impression it leaves in the cold earth at the center of a forgotten foundation. I have not been back, but the compass on my desk, which has sat in the same spot for 11 years and never moved, has been spinning slowly since the night I came home. And sometimes, in the deep quiet of a house where everyone else is asleep, I feel the silence change quality. I feel it become attentive. I feel it start to count. Whatever's on that ridge is patient. It has been counting for a very long time, and it does not lose track of the ones it has already measured. Story 7. House was watching. There are properties listed for sale in rural Pennsylvania that no real estate agent will show you in person. I know that now. I did not know it 3 years ago when I pulled onto a gravel lane in Fayette County on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. Alone, with nothing but my phone, a printed listing sheet, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly scared in your adult life. I am 53 years old. I renovate and resell houses for a living. I have walked through hundreds of abandoned, neglected, and genuinely horrifying properties in my career. I have stepped over dead animals and through floors soft with rot and into basements that smelled like things I still cannot name. I thought I had seen everything a neglected house could show a person. I had not seen anything. Not until Fayette County. Not until the house at the end of that gravel lane showed me what it had been keeping inside its walls for a very long time. The listing had been sitting on the market for over 2 years. That was the first thing I should have paid attention to. The first eerie warning sign I walked right past without slowing down. 2 years is a long time for a property in any market, even a rural one, even a house in the condition this one was clearly in from the photographs. The listing price had been cut 4 times. It started at $140,000, and by the time I found it, it was sitting at $62,000, which in Fayette County for a 3-bedroom farmhouse on 4 acres is the kind of number that should have triggered every instinct I had developed over 20 years of doing this work. Prices do not fall that far that fast without a reason. Sometimes the reason is structural damage. Sometimes it is a title problem. Sometimes, and I understand how this sounds, the reason is something that does not show up in any inspection report. I parked at the end of the gravel lane at roughly 2:30 in the afternoon. The sky was overcast in that flat, gray, suffocating way that Pennsylvania does in the fall, the kind of sky that makes everything beneath it look slightly drained of color. The house was visible from the road, set back maybe 150 yards, surrounded by overgrown fields that had once been cleared farmland and were slowly being reclaimed by tall grass and young trees pushing up from the edges. The house itself was 2 stories. White paint gone to gray and peeling in long strips, a covered front porch that sagged on the left side, all the windows dark. From a distance, it looked like every other distressed farmhouse I had ever evaluated. From a distance, nothing about it seemed particularly scary or disturbing. From a distance, the house looked like a project, a problem to be solved with money and labor and time. I walked the gravel lane toward it. The stones crunched under my boots in the heavy afternoon silence. There was no wind. The overgrown fields on either side of the lane were completely still, the tall grass not moving at all. I noticed that the silence was total. No birds, no insects, no distant farm equipment or road noise from the county highway behind me. Just my footsteps on the gravel and the sound of my own breathing. I told myself that was just the weather, the overcast sky pressing everything down. I had felt that kind of heavy silence before on gray days, and it had never meant anything. I kept walking. The porch steps held my weight, barely. The front door was locked, which was normal for a property listed with an agent. I had the lockbox code from the listing, punched it in, and pulled out a key that was cold in a way that seemed like more than just the autumn air. I unlocked the door and pushed it open, and the smell hit me immediately. Not rot, not mold, though there was some of that underneath. Something older, something organic and dark and deeply, profoundly wrong in a way I could not immediately attach to any specific source. I have smelled a lot of things in old houses. I have never smelled anything quite like that. It was like the smell of something that had been sealed in for a long time and was only now, with the door open, beginning to breathe again. I stepped inside. The front room was empty. Bare wood floors, stained in large dark patches near the center. Wallpaper peeling from plaster walls in long, curling strips. A brick fireplace on the north wall, the inside of it blackened, the grate rusted completely through. The windows were grimy but intact. Enough gray light came through them to see clearly without my flashlight, which I unclipped from my belt anyway and switched on out of habit. The beam moved across the room slowly, and I noted the obvious things. Ceiling was compromised in one corner, probably a roof leak. The plaster walls had cracking consistent with foundation settling. The floors were solid despite the staining. I took photographs and moved toward the hallway at the back of the room. That was when I noticed the marks on the wall, not the peeling wallpaper. Behind the wallpaper, on the plaster itself, someone had made marks with something dark, something that looked like charcoal or a very soft pencil. The marks were visible where large sections of wallpaper had fallen away, and they covered the plaster completely in those sections, edge to edge, floor to ceiling. They were not graffiti in any recognizable sense. Not words, not tags, not symbols I could identify. They were lines, thousands of them, short, parallel lines grouped in sets of 5, the way a prisoner marks days on a cell wall. I stood in the middle of that front room and turned slowly and counted the exposed sections of wall and tried to estimate the total number of marks. I stopped estimating when the number got too large to be reasonable. Too large to represent any span of time a single person could have spent in one place making marks on a wall. I almost left. I want to be clear about that. Something inside me, something below the level of conscious thought, something that I think of now as the part of the brain that was keeping score before I understood the game, wanted very badly to walk back out the front door, put the key in the lockbox, walk down the gravel lane, get in my truck, and drive away. I felt it as a physical sensation, a pulling in my chest, a heaviness in my legs. But I was a professional. I had a job to do. I told myself the marks were old. I told myself some previous occupant had been eccentric or disturbed or both. I told myself I was not going to let some creepy wallpaper push me out of a $62,000 opportunity. I took photographs of the marks and moved into the hallway. The kitchen was at the back of the house. It was in worse condition than the front room. The ceiling had partially collapsed over the sink, and the afternoon light came through the gap in a column of gray that illuminated a floor covered in debris. But that was not what stopped me in the kitchen doorway. What stopped me was the table. A small wooden table, 4 chairs around it, positioned in the center of the kitchen as if someone had just set it up. Not old, not covered in dust the way everything else in the house was covered in dust. The table and chairs were clean. Relatively, conspicuously, disturbingly clean. And on the table, positioned at one of the 4-place settings, was a single coffee mug. I walked to the table and held my flashlight over the mug and looked inside it. There was dried residue at the bottom. Not ancient residue. Not something that had been sitting there for the years or decades the rest of the house suggested. It was the kind of residue a mug gets when coffee is left in it for a week, maybe 2. Someone had been in this house recently. Someone had been sitting at this table. I took a photograph of the mug and stood very still in the kitchen and listened. The silence of the house was different from the silence outside. Outside it had been heavy and total. Inside it was something else. Active. The kind of silence that has texture and weight because something nearby is maintaining it deliberately. I have been in a lot of empty buildings. I know what empty sounds like. That kitchen did not sound empty. It sounded like a room that was pretending to be empty. I should have left. I did not leave. I told myself that a property like this might have a squatter situation, which was not uncommon in rural distressed properties, and that the professional thing to do was to complete my evaluation and report what I found to the listing agent. I moved back to the hallway and found the staircase to the 2nd floor. The staircase was solid, the treads barely creaking under my weight. I went up. The upstairs hallway had 3 doors, 2 open, 1 closed. I checked the open rooms first. Both were empty. Both showed the same peeling wallpaper and plaster marking pattern as the room below, though in these upper rooms the marks were different. Not the group lines. These were drawings, crude, simple drawings of people, figures, dozens of them, rendered in what I now believe was the same dark charcoal material as the marks downstairs. The figures were all standing, all facing the same direction, all facing the window. Each figure was drawn with its head tilted at a slight angle. Every single one, the same angle. I stood in the second of those 2 rooms for a long time looking at those figures and feeling a fear so cold and so deep and so genuine that it pushed through every professional layer I had built up over 20 years and reached something much older and more honest underneath. Then I heard the sound from behind the closed door. It was not a loud sound. It was not a dramatic sound. It was the sound of weight shifting on an old floor. One creak, deliberate and slow, like something in that room adjusting its position. Like something in that room that had been very still for a very long time had moved just slightly. I stood in the hallway and stared at that closed door and felt the darkness of the house gather behind me, and I did not move. My flashlight beam was steady on the door handle, a tarnished brass oval, and I watched it with an intensity I have never given anything before or since. I watched it for what felt like 5 minutes, though when I checked my phone later I think it was closer to 90 seconds. The handle did not move. No further sound came from behind the door. But the silence that followed that single creak was the most terrifying, most disturbing, most profoundly wrong silence I have ever experienced in my life. Because it was the silence of something on the other side of a door that knew I was standing on this side of it. I moved to the staircase. I went down. I walked through the front room without looking at the marks on the walls. I went through the front door and pulled it shut behind me and walked down the porch steps and started down the gravel lane toward my truck. I did not run. I am still not entirely sure why I did not run, except that the same instinct that had kept score throughout my time in that house was now telling me very clearly that running would be the wrong choice. That running would change things. I walked at a pace that I could sustain without drawing attention to the fact that every single part of me was screaming to go faster. I was halfway down the lane when I looked back at the house. Every window was dark. I had expected that. But in the upper right window, the window of the room with the closed door, there was a shape. A shadow inside the darkness. A silhouette pressed close to the glass from the inside, standing very still, watching me walk away. The shape was roughly human. Roughly. The proportions were slightly wrong in ways that my eyes registered but that my brain did not want to process in any detail. The head was tilted at an angle, the same angle as the figures drawn on the walls. I turned back toward my truck and I kept walking and I did not look back again. I reached my truck. I got in. I locked the doors. I drove out to the county highway and then I pulled over on the shoulder and sat there for almost 20 minutes before I was steady enough to drive safely. Then I drove to a diner in Uniontown and ordered coffee I did not drink and sat in a booth by the window and tried to organize what I had experienced into something that fit inside a rational framework. I largely failed at that. Some things do not fit inside rational frameworks. Some things are disturbing specifically because they sit just outside the boundary of what can be explained, in that eerie, chilling, nightmare space between what you know and what you cannot afford to believe. I called the listing agent that evening. I told her I had done a walkthrough and had some concerns about the property, and I mentioned the table and the mug and what I thought might be evidence of recent occupation. There was a pause on the line that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. Then she told me that I was not the first person to report something similar. She told me that a woman had visited the property 8 months earlier, a private buyer doing her own walkthrough the same way I had. She said the woman had parked at the end of the gravel lane and gone in and that her car had been found there the following morning. Driver, door closed. Engine off. Key in the lockbox. No sign of the woman. She said the local sheriff had investigated and found nothing. She said the house had appeared empty. She said the case was still open. I did not ask the listing agent how many people had walked through that property before the woman who disappeared. I did not ask how long the table and chairs had been in the kitchen or who had put them there. I did not ask what the sheriff had found, if anything, behind the closed door at the end of the upstairs hallway. I did not ask these things because somewhere in the back of my mind I had already started to understand that those questions would lead me toward answers that would make the fear I had felt in that house permanent. Some knowledge changes a person in ways that cannot be changed back. Some doors, once opened, do not close again. I have not returned to Fayette County. The property is still listed. I checked last month and it is still sitting there, still at $62,000, still showing the same photographs of the front porch and the overgrown fields and the dark windows. 2 years and 8 months on the market now. No sale pending. I look at the listing sometimes late at night when I cannot sleep, which happens more often than it used to, and I study the photographs with the particular attention of someone who knows what is behind the front door, what is on the walls, what is sitting on the kitchen table, and what stands in the upper right window when it hears someone walking back down the gravel lane. In the most recent listing photographs, the ones updated about 6 months ago, the front porch looks slightly different from the older photos. One of the porch chairs, the one on the right side near the sagging corner, has been moved. In the old photographs, it was pushed up against the wall. In the new photographs, it is facing outward, toward the lane, toward the road, toward whoever might be coming. Someone moved that chair. Something moved that chair. It is positioned the way a chair is positioned when someone intends to sit in it for a long time. The way something sits when it is waiting. In Fayette County, Pennsylvania, not every property is as abandoned as it looks. I know that now. I know it the way I know the sound my own heartbeat makes in a silent room. The way I know the specific quality of darkness in a house that is pretending to be empty. I walked out of that house. I walked down that gravel lane and I got in my truck and I drove away. And I tell myself that is the end of my story. That I was one of the ones who left. But sometimes, in that half-conscious space between waking and sleep, I hear a floorboard creak behind a closed door. And I feel the gray Fayette County sky pressing down on everything. And I think about the woman whose car was found at the end of the lane with the driver, his door closed and the key in the lockbox. And I understand that the house did not take her violently. That is not what that house does. That house waits. It has always waited. It tilts its head at an angle no healthy thing should, and it watches from the upper window and it waits, with a patience older and darker and more terrifying than anything I have words for the person who will walk in and simply not walk back out. For the person who will feel, just for a moment, that the silence inside is easier than everything outside. For the person who will sit down at the table and decide to stay. Story 8. Last stop. There are missing persons cases that the police understand, and then there are the ones they file away in a drawer and never speak about again. I know which kind mine almost was. I know because I was the man at the bus stop in Scranton, Pennsylvania, on a February night so cold the air felt like it had teeth. And I know what stepped out of the darkness toward me in those few seconds when the camera stopped seeing me. I know what it felt like to stand at the exact edge of whatever comes after ordinary life, close enough to smell it, close enough to feel its cold breath on the side of my face. Most people who get that close do not come back to tell anyone anything. I am still not entirely sure I came back as the same person who left. My name is Dennis Calhoun. I am 48 years old. I worked for 11 years as a maintenance supervisor for a mid-sized logistics company in Scranton, which is the kind of city that used to be something and now is mostly the memory of something. Old brick buildings and narrow streets and a stubborn working-class pride that holds the whole place together like wire inside a crumbling wall. I am not dramatic by nature. I am not imaginative in the way that leads a person toward horror stories or ghost hunting or late-night message boards about the paranormal. I coached youth baseball for 6 years. I own a used Ford pickup and a beagle named Carl. I am, in every measurable way, an ordinary man who lived an ordinary life right up until the moment that the terrifying thing happened and I discovered that ordinary life is a very thin shell over something vast and dark and completely indifferent to everything I thought was real. It was a Thursday night in February, the 14th, which I mentioned because it later felt significant in a way I cannot quite articulate, the way certain dates have a weight that only becomes visible in hindsight. My truck was in the shop, a busted alternator. Nothing dramatic. I had worked late because we had a freight issue that needed sorting, and by the time I locked up the office and walked out into the night, it was past 11 and the last bus that would get me close to my apartment ran at 11:47 from a stop on Linden Street, outside a 24-hour convenience store called Patel, just that I had been walking past for a decade without ever going inside. The cold that night was the serious kind, not the kind that is merely uncomfortable, but the kind that changes how the world sounds, that makes the air brittle and the silence particular. A muffled, padded silence like the city is wrapped in something. There was no wind, which somehow made it worse. Wind is alive. Wind is the world in motion. The stillness that night was the stillness of a held breath, and walking through it felt like walking through something that was aware of me, something that was watching with a patience so absolute it did not need to move or make a sound. I got to the bus stop at 11:29. I know the exact time because I checked my phone when I arrived and thought I had 18 minutes to wait, which at that temperature felt like a small punishment. The stop was a simple metal bench and a pole with the route information on it, set back slightly from the curb in front of Patel's plate glass window. The store was lit up in that flat, harsh fluorescent way that convenience stores are always lit, a bright rectangle of ordinary life in the dark city block. I could see the clerk inside, a young man I did not recognize, sitting behind the counter reading something. There were no other customers. The street was empty in both directions as far as I could see. The dark blocks of old Scranton buildings running away into the night, their windows dark, their doorways full of shadow. The security camera for Patel's was mounted above the front door, aimed at the sidewalk and the bus stop. I know this because the police showed me the footage later, showed me myself arriving and standing and beginning to pace back and forth in front of a window the way you do when the cold is serious and standing still starts to feel dangerous. They showed me pacing. And then they showed me stepping to the left, out of the frame, just briefly, just a few seconds. And then the footage showed the empty bus stop, and the bus arriving at 11:47 and waiting its standard 45 seconds and pulling away. And the bus stop remaining empty for the rest of the night. What they could not show me was what happened in those few seconds. What moved me out of the frame. What I found when I stepped to the left into the shadow beside the convenience store wall. What spoke to me, if spoke is even the right word for what it did. The camera did not see it. The clerk inside did not see it. The empty street did not see it. But I saw it, and I felt it, and 8 months later it is still the most terrifying thing I have ever experienced. More than the diagnosis my father got in 2009. More than the car accident on 84 in 2016. More than anything that has ever happened to me in a world I thought I understood. I started pacing because of the cold. That part is simple. Back and forth in front of the window. 4 steps one way. 4 steps back, watching my breath cloud and dissolve in the frigid air, listening to the particular silence of a winter city at nearly midnight. I was thinking about nothing important. The freight issue at work, what was in my refrigerator, whether Carl had water in his bowl, the unremarkable interior weather of an unremarkable man at the end of an unremarkable day. And then I became aware of something to my left. Not a sound, not a movement, more like a change in the quality of the darkness beside the building. A deepening, a density that had not been there before. I have tried many times to describe this more precisely and I cannot. It was as if the shadow at the left edge of the store had become more substantial, more intentional, as if it had gone from being an absence of light to being a presence in its own right. A chilling, specific presence. And with that change in the darkness came the smell. I have smelled fear before. My own and other people's. that sharp animal musk that the body produces in genuine danger. This was not that smell. This was something older and stranger, like iron and wet earth, and something beneath both of those. Something without a name in any category of smell I had ever encountered. The olfactory equivalent of a sound too low to hear but felt in the chest. I stopped pacing. I turned my head toward the shadow. And the shadow moved. Not the way shadows move when the light source changes. Not the natural drift of darkness adjusting to its environment. This was a movement with intent. A slow, deliberate shift. The shadow condensing and reconfiguring the way smoke moves in still air, but with a purpose behind it, a direction, an awareness. It moved toward me the way something moves when it has decided to move. When it has chosen. When it is no longer simply waiting but beginning. I want to be clear about what I did next, because people who have heard parts of this story sometimes assume I ran. I did not run. I could not run. This is not a metaphor or an attempt to make the story more dramatic. My legs stopped being mine. The cold from the air seemed to migrate inside me and settle in the spaces between my muscles and my bones. And I stood with my feet on the cold sidewalk of Linden Street, and I watched the shadow come toward me, and I was as immobile as the building behind me. It stopped about 3 feet away. I could feel it the way you feel a hot surface when you hold your hand near it, except the opposite, not heat radiating outward but cold being drawn inward. My warmth being pulled in some direction that was not toward the shadow but through me. As if I were a window it was drawing heat through. My eyes were open. The shadow had no specific shape, no form I could describe to a sketch artist or a therapist or a police detective. But it had edges and it had depth and it had, most horribly, what I can only call attention. It was paying attention to me. Specific, focused, terrible attention. The way a predator pays attention to prey. Except beneath the predatory quality there was something else. Something I have spent months trying to name. The closest I can come is curiosity. It was curious about me. It was examining me the way a person examines something they have never seen before. I felt it go through me. That is the only language I have. Not physically, not like a hand reaching inside my chest, but cognitively, the way a scanner passes over a document. I felt things being looked at. Memories, not in a cinematic flashback way, not like my life passing before my eyes, but more like the sensation of someone reading over your shoulder. Awareness of being accessed, of information being retrieved by something other than yourself. I felt it find my daughter, who is 23 and lives in Philadelphia. I felt it find my father, his face the week before he died. I felt it find the specific texture of the fear I had at 7 years old when I got lost in the woods behind my family, this cabin in the Poconos for 4 hours before my uncle found me. The specific quality of that childhood terror at the realization that the world is vastly larger than a person and does not particularly care whether that person finds their way home. It was in me for what felt like several minutes, and what the camera apparently showed was a few seconds. Then it withdrew. Not quickly, not like a hand being pulled back, but the way water drains, gradually and completely. And when it was gone, I felt hollow in a way I had never felt before. The hollowness of something having been in a space that was previously full. The cold returned to being exterior cold rather than interior cold. My legs worked. The shadow beside the building was just a shadow. I do not know where I went for the next several hours. This is the part that the police found most significant and most disturbing. And it is the part one find most impossible to account for, because it is not that I have a gap in my memory of those hours. It is that there is simply nothing there. No gap. No black space. No sense of missing time. In my experience, the bus stop moment ended and was followed immediately by standing at the door of my apartment. No transition. No journey. Just the bus stop and then my apartment door. As if the space between had been edited out by something with authority over the timeline of my life. My phone showed 4:17 in the morning when I got inside. I had been at the bus stop at 11:29. I had been somewhere, or in some state of being, for almost 5 hours. And I had no more access to those 5 hours than I have access to the years before I was born. Carl was asleep on the couch. He woke up when I came in and looked at me and then looked away and put his head back down, which is something he had never done before. Carl has been my dog for 6 years. He greets me when I come home from work with the full-body enthusiasm of a creature for whom my return is the best thing that has happened all day. That night he looked at me and looked away and went back to sleep, and the creeping, eerie horror of that small detail sat with me for a long time, long after the police interviews and the wellness checks and the concerned calls from my sister in Bethlehem. Carl knew something was different. Carl could smell or sense or perceive something about me that had changed in the shadow beside Patel, this convenience store on Linden Street. And whatever he sensed, it was not something that called for enthusiasm. The police found me the next afternoon. A neighbor had called when she saw my truck still missing and noticed my mail had not been taken in. Not knowing my truck was in the shop and not knowing I had come home in the early hours of the morning and immediately fallen into the deepest sleep I have ever experienced, a sleep with no dreams and no movement and no awareness of time passing, like a factory reset, like something had taken everything out and put most of it back and switched me off while it worked. The officers were careful and professional. They asked about drugs and alcohol and mental health history and whether I had anyone in my life who might want to cause me harm. The security footage troubled them visibly, the stepping out of frame, the failure to return, the bus leaving without me. They filed a report. They checked on me twice in the following 2 weeks. And then, as these things go, they filed it away in the drawer. I went back to work. I got my truck out of the shop. I coached the last 3 games of the winter indoor baseball clinic I had committed to before February. I did all of the things a person does when they are attempting to reassemble ordinary life around a hole that has been punched through the middle of it. And mostly it worked. Mostly I'm fine. Mostly the days go by with their ordinary cargo of tasks and small satisfactions and the simple company of a dog who has, gradually, gone back to greeting me normally at the door. Though sometimes, in certain lights, I catch him watching me in a way he did not watch me before. A way that is more careful, more evaluating, more like the way you watch something you have decided to trust again but have not entirely finished deciding. What I know, and what I have accepted with the particular peace that comes from having no alternative to acceptance, is that whatever was in that shadow did not hurt me and did not take me and chose, for reasons that are not available to my understanding, to let me continue. But it also did not leave me unchanged. I notice things now that I did not notice before. Not supernatural things, not visions or voices or anything that would concern a psychiatrist. Subtler things, the particular quality of darkness at the edge of a lit space. The moments when the silence of a winter night becomes too intentional, too still, too much like a held breath. The way certain shadows in certain lights seem denser than they should be, more present, more aware. I notice these things and I do not investigate them. I keep walking. I stay in the light. I take a different route home if the dark feels too inhabited. There is a missing persons case file somewhere in a Scranton police record system with my name on it, technically still open, practically closed, the kind of case that nobody revisits because there are no suspects and no evidence of a crime and the subject turned up alive and apparently well, if a little quieter than before, a little more careful about where he stands at night, a little less confident in the absolute reliability of a world he used to take completely for granted. I think about the other cases, the ones where the subject did not turn up. The ones where the camera showed a person and then showed an empty space and kept showing an empty space for all the nights and weeks and months that followed. I think about them and I wonder what the shadow found when it went through them, what it was looking for and whether it found it, and whether finding it was what made the difference between those people and me. I wonder if it is still out there on Linden Street, or in a dozen Linden Streets in a dozen Pennsylvania cities. Patient in the way that things are patient when they do not experience time the way we do, waiting at the edge of the light for the next ordinary person to step to the left. Do not stand at empty bus stops in the cold. Do not let your attention drift toward the edge of the light. And if the darkness beside the building seems denser than it should be, if the silence becomes too deliberate, if you smell something that has no name in any category of smell you have ever known, do not turn your head toward it. Do not give it your attention, because it is looking for something inside ordinary people. And the most terrifying truth I can leave you with is this. I still do not know whether it found what it was looking for in me, or whether it left because I did not have it. And on the nights when Carl watches me from across the room with those careful, evaluating eyes, I wonder if he knows the answer and I do not. I wonder what came home that February night. I wonder if it was entirely me. Story 9. Something else on the trail. What does it feel like to be the last person to see a man before he vanishes forever? I have been asking myself that question for 14 months. And the answer changes every time I sit down to think about it. Because the honest truth is that I am not entirely sure I was the last person to see him. I am not entirely sure person is even the right word for what else might have been out there on that trail with us. That is the part that keeps this story alive in the darkest corner of my mind. That is the part that makes it a nightmare I cannot wake up from, because I am already awake when it finds me. My name does not matter. What matters is that I was hiking alone in the Delaware Water Gap in late September, on a Tuesday when the trails were mostly empty and the Pennsylvania sky was that particular shade of cold blue that only comes in early fall. and I met a man named Marcus on a ridge overlooking the river, and 2 days later his backpack was found beside the trail by a ranger doing a routine check, and Marcus was nowhere. No signs of a struggle. No blood. No body. Just wilderness stretching in every direction like a green and terrifying secret that the land had been keeping for a very long time. I need you to sit with that image for a moment before I go any further. A backpack beside a trail. Neatly placed. Not dropped in a hurry. Not thrown. Set down with intention, the way you set something down when you expect to come back to it. His water bottle was clipped to the outside. His trekking poles were leaning against a tree. His phone was inside the front pocket, and the last text message he sent, discovered when investigators finally got into the device, read simply, "I think I am not alone." No period, no follow-up, just those 6 words hanging in the air of a dead phone like smoke in a closed room, and then nothing. I met Marcus at approximately 2 in the afternoon on a Sunday. I had been on the trail since early morning, working my way north along the Appalachian Trail section that cuts through the Water Gap, which is one of the most genuinely beautiful and genuinely remote stretches of trail in the entire northeastern United States. Beautiful and remote, those two things go together out there in a way that feels like a gift until suddenly it feels like a trap. The forest in late September has a quality to it that I can only describe as both stunning and eerie. The leaves just beginning to turn. The light coming through the canopy at a low angle that makes long shadows even at midday. The trail itself winding through terrain so old and so indifferent to human presence that you feel, on the best days, profoundly humbled. On the worst days you feel something else entirely. Marcus was sitting on a flat rock at a viewpoint overlooking the Delaware River when I came around the bend and nearly walked into him. He was maybe 50, heavy set, with a gray beard and the kind of worn gear that tells you a man has been doing this for a long time and knows what he's doing. We did what hikers do, nodded, exchanged a few words about the weather and the trail conditions, shared the view for a few minutes in comfortable silence. He mentioned he was camping solo that night at a site about 3 miles north. I told him I was heading to a different site, further east, planning to come out the next morning. We parted ways with a wave, and I watched him disappear around a curve in the trail heading north. And that was the last confirmed sighting of Marcus alive. The first disturbing thing happened to me that same night, though I did not recognize it for what it was at the time. I reached my campsite around 5, set up my tent, made dinner, and sat by a small fire watching the dark come down over the trees. The Delaware Water Gap at night is one of the quieter places I have ever camped, which is part of why I go back there, or used to go back there. The river sound carries up from below if the wind is right, a low and constant murmur that is deeply calming. The forest sounds at night are familiar to anyone who camps regularly. Owls, wind in the upper branches, the distant snap of a twig as a deer moves through underbrush. I know all of those sounds. I have been camping since I was 12 years old. I know exactly what the woods sound like when nothing is wrong. What I heard around 10 that night was not any of those sounds. It was coming from the ridge above my campsite, maybe 200 feet uphill in the darkness, and the best description I could give it is this. It was rhythmic, and it was low, and it had a quality to it that made my brain refuse to categorize it. Not animal, not wind, not mechanical, something that borrowed from all of those things without being any of them, and that lasted for perhaps 45 seconds before stopping with a completeness that felt deliberate. Like something had been listening and heard what it needed to hear, and stopped. I sat very still by my dying fire for a long time after that. I am not a man who frightens easily in the woods. I have camped hundreds of nights in the backcountry, and I have encountered bears and coyotes and all the things that people imagine are out there, and none of them produced in me the particular creeping horror that sound produced that night. Because the most unsettling thing about it was not the sound itself but what the sound implied. It implied intent. It implied something that was making noise with a purpose, and that had chosen to stop making noise with an equal and opposite purpose. The silence that followed it was not the ordinary silence of a forest at night. It was a watching silence, an aware silence, the silence of something that had gone very deliberately still. I went into my tent and zipped it closed and lay on top of my sleeping bag with my flashlight in my hand and my pocket knife open beside me. And I will tell you honestly that I did not sleep for a very long time. At some point exhaustion pulled me under, and I slept without dreaming. And when I woke up in the gray pre-dawn light, everything seemed fine. The forest was doing its ordinary morning things. Birds, mist, the smell of cold, damp earth. I broke camp quickly and started down the trail toward the parking area. and by the time I got to my car I had almost convinced myself that the sound had been a barred owl doing something unusual, or the wind finding a hollow log, or any of the dozen rational explanations that daylight provides for the fears of the night before. I drove home. I went back to my ordinary life. And then 4 days later I got a call from a Pennsylvania State Police investigator asking if I had encountered a man named Marcus during my hike. Because Marcus had been reported missing by his wife when he failed to come home, and a search was underway, and my vehicle registration had flagged me as someone who had been in the area on the relevant dates. I confirmed what I knew, which was very little. I described meeting him at the viewpoint. I gave him the time and the direction he was heading. I mentioned, with some hesitation, the sound I had heard that night, and the investigator listened politely and said they would note it, and something in his voice told me he was already filing it in the category of things that sounded strange but would not help him find a missing man in 200,000 acres of Pennsylvania wilderness. 2 days after that call, the backpack was found. I read about it in a local news brief that someone sent me, and I sat with my phone in my hands for a long time reading those 6 words over and over. I think I am not alone. I have a background in trail safety, and I have thought about those words from every possible angle in the 14 months since. The most natural interpretation is that he heard or saw something that suggested another person was nearby, and he was reaching out to let someone know his location or his concern. That is the rational reading. But there is another reading that lives underneath the rational one, a darker and more disturbing reading that comes forward in the middle of the night when I cannot sleep and the house is quiet and I am alone with what I actually know rather than what I can comfortably explain. The other reading is that whatever was near Marcus was not something he had a word for. That he sent those 6 words not as a location check or a safety measure, but as the closest thing he could find in ordinary language to describe an experience that ordinary language was not built to describe. The search lasted 10 days. Helicopters, dogs, grid searches, the full deployment of resources that a missing person case in a national recreation area can generate. They found nothing, not a footprint beyond the immediate vicinity of the backpack, not a scrap of clothing caught on a branch, not any indication in any direction of where Marcus had gone or what had happened to him. The investigators I spoke to in the weeks that followed were professional and careful in their language, but I am good at reading what people are not saying. And what they were not saying was that they had no working theory. They had a backpack and a text message and 200,000 acres of forest and no thread connecting any of it. Here is the thing I have never told anyone officially, the part of this account that I have been building toward and that I want you to sit with carefully. 3 weeks after Marcus disappeared, I went back to the Delaware water gap. I am still not sure why, or rather I am sure why, but the reason does not reflect well on me, which is that I could not leave it alone. The not knowing had gotten into me the way a splinter gets into a finger, invisible but constantly present, and I told myself I was going back to hike, to reclaim the trail, to not let a disturbing experience take away a place I loved. But really I was going back because I needed to stand on that ridge where I had met Marcus and look north up the trail and try to feel something that would help me understand. I parked in the same lot on a Wednesday morning in late October. The trees were fully turned by then, the forest a deep and haunted gold and red that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. I signed in at the trailhead register, which is a habit so deeply ingrained that I do it without thinking, and I noticed as I flipped through the register pages that the last several weeks of entries were sparse. October is not peak season in the water gap, but it is not empty either. The low number of entries struck me as odd, and I asked about it at the ranger station near the lot, and the ranger on duty, a young woman who chose her words with the careful precision of someone who has been instructed to be careful, told me that visitor numbers had been lower than average for the past few weeks. She did not say why. She said it the way people say something when there is a very large thing they are declining to attach to the statement. I hiked north. The trail was empty and the air was cold and the light came through the turned leaves in a way that was both gorgeous and deeply eerie, the world burning quietly around me in shades of amber and rust. I reached the viewpoint where I had met Marcus around noon, and I stood on that flat rock and looked out over the river, and I thought about him sitting there in the blue September afternoon, the comfortable competence of a man who knew what he was doing in wild places, the easy wave he had given me before disappearing around the curve. I stayed there for maybe 20 minutes, and then I turned and looked north up the trail in the direction he had gone, and I felt it. I do not have better language for this than what I am about to give you, and I want you to understand that I have tried. I have tried for 14 months to find more precise words for what I felt standing on that ridge looking north. What I felt was the specific and chilling sensation of being observed by something that did not want to be detected but also did not particularly care whether it was detected. the way a very large and very confident predator does not bother to hide because it has no reason to fear what it is watching. It was a feeling of weight and age and absolute indifference to my presence as an individual, while simultaneously being entirely focused on me as a thing that was standing in a particular place and breathing and generating heat and sound and all the signals that living things generate. I felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with eyes. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, and then I turned around and walked back down the trail at a pace that I will admit was close to a run for the first quarter mile. The forest on either side of the trail was perfectly still, which is itself a kind of horror when you are deep in Pennsylvania woodland in October, because the forest is never perfectly still when everything is normal. Birds move, leaves fall, squirrels crash through the underbrush with their particular frantic energy, but the forest on either side of me as I moved south was absolutely, completely, terrifyingly still, as if every living thing in it had gone quiet and motionless at the same moment, and the only moving object in the entire tableau was me, making too much noise, breathing too hard, my boots loud on the packed dirt of the trail, the most obvious and exposed thing in the landscape. I got to the parking lot. I got to my car. I drove south on Interstate 80 and did not look in the rearview mirror for the first 10 miles because something in me was absolutely certain that looking back was the wrong thing to do. Not rationally certain, but certain the way you are certain of things in nightmares, with a conviction that bypasses logic entirely and speaks directly to something older and more fundamental in the brain. Something that has been keeping people alive in dark places since long before we had words for the things in the dark. Marcus has never been found. The case is technically still open, classified as a missing person with no confirmed cause of disappearance, which is the official language for we do not know what happened and we are not sure we ever will. His wife gave an interview to a regional outdoor magazine 6 months after he vanished, and she said something in that interview that I have thought about almost every day since I read it. She said that Marcus had told her, on the phone the night before the day he disappeared, that the forest felt different that trip. She said he could not explain what he meant by different, that he had tried and had not found the words for it, and that she had told him he was tired and to get some sleep and they would talk when he got home. Different, the most ordinary word in the world, deployed in place of the terrifying and specific thing he could not bring himself to say. I go back and forth on whether to return to the Delaware Water Gap. Part of me, the part that has been camping and hiking for 30 years and that has a very strong feeling about not surrendering beloved places to fear, says I should go back next spring when the trail is busy and the days are long and the forest is full of the ordinary sounds of ordinary life doing its ordinary thing. Another part of me, smaller and quieter but considerably harder to argue with, says that something out there in those beautiful and eerie Pennsylvania hills has already seen me twice. It let me walk away twice, and that there's a specific and chilling limit to how many times you can walk through a place where something is watching before it decides that the watching has gone on long enough, before the patience that has held you safe runs out like water from a cupped hand, before you send a final text to someone who loves you and set your backpack neatly against a tree and step off the trail and into whatever darkness has been waiting, with total and terrifying stillness, for you to come back one more time. Story 10. Land took my brother. There are moments that divide a life into before and after. I have one of those moments. It happened at 4:47 in the morning on a Tuesday in November, on the farm where my brother and I grew up, in a county in rural Pennsylvania where the fields go dark at night in a way that city people do not have a vocabulary for. Not just dark, absent. Like the darkness out, there's not the absence of light but the presence of something else entirely. Something old and patient and deeply, profoundly indifferent to the people who have built their lives on top of it. My brother Marcus went out to check the livestock before dawn that morning and he did not come back. His boots were found near the barn door, set side by side, neat and careful, the way a man sets his boots down when he intends to come back for them. The animals were unsettled but unharmed. Marcus was gone, and the terrifying, chilling, haunting truth that I have spent 3 years trying to find the edges of is this: the land in rural Pennsylvania does not always give back what it takes. Sometimes it keeps it, sometimes it keeps everything. I want to tell you what happened before that morning, because the horror of what I experienced in the days after Marcus disappeared only makes sense if you understand what I saw in the weeks leading up to it. I want to tell you because I think someone else needs to know. Because I think the farm is still there, and the darkness over those fields is still there, and whatever moved through that darkness on a Tuesday morning in November is still there too, waiting with a patience that makes human time feel like nothing at all. My name is Carl Briggs. I am 48 years old. I have worked with my hands my entire adult life, first on the farm with my father and then in construction when the farm stopped being profitable enough to support 2 families. Marcus stayed. He always was the one who belonged to that land more completely than I did. The one who could stand at the edge of the east field at sunset and look out over the furrows in the fence line and the dark tree line beyond and feel something that looked from the outside like peace. I could never quite manage that. The land always made me feel watched. Even as a kid, even on the brightest summer afternoons, I would glance toward the tree line at the far end of the east field and feel the eerie, crawling certainty that something at the edge of those trees was looking back at me. I told Marcus about it once when we were teenagers. He laughed. He said the farm was the safest place in the world. He said he would die there. He did not mean it as anything dark. He meant it as a declaration of love for a piece of ground that had shaped everything he was. He was right and wrong at the same time, in ways I am still sorting through. The first strange thing happened 6 weeks before Marcus disappeared. He called me on a Sunday evening, which was not unusual. We talked most Sundays, but the quality of the call was different from the start. His voice had a flatness to it, a disconnected quality, like he was describing something he was watching from a distance rather than something he was actively experiencing. He told me the cattle had been acting wrong for about a week. Not sick, not injured, unsettled in a way he had never seen before, and Marcus had been around cattle his entire life. He said they would not go near the far end of the barn after dark. He said they pressed themselves toward the south wall every night and stayed there until morning. He said the sound they made was not any sound he recognized from 40 years of working with animals. A low, continuous sound, not quite mooing. Something below that. Something that he said made the fillings in his back teeth ache. I asked him what he thought was causing it. He said he did not know. He said he had walked the perimeter of the barn and the field every evening for a week and had found nothing. No predator signs, no tracks, no damage to the fence line. Nothing that explained what the animals were responding to. I told him to call the county extension office. He said he would. He did not. Or if he did, he never mentioned it again. The second strange thing happened 3 weeks after that call. I drove out to the farm on a Saturday to help Marcus repair a section of fence on the north boundary, a 2-hour job that turned into 5 because the ground was harder than expected and the post hole digger kept hitting rock. We finished around 4 in the afternoon and stood at the north fence line drinking water from a thermos and looking out over the east field in the gray November light. The field was harvested, the corn long gone, the ground bare and dark and flat all the way to the tree line about 400 yards away. I was looking at the tree line, the way I always looked at the tree line on that farm, with that old familiar eerie feeling of being observed, when I saw something move at the edge of the trees. Not an animal movement, not the kind of quick, low movement a deer makes entering or leaving a field. Something slower, something at roughly human height. A shadow at the edge of the tree line that moved laterally, slowly, and then stopped. And stayed. I watched it for almost 2 full minutes. It did not move again. It just stood there, at the edge of the trees, in the failing afternoon light, at a distance too far to make out any detail but close enough that I was absolutely certain it was there and that it was not a tree and that it was not any animal I could name. I pointed it out to Marcus. He looked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had been seeing it for about a month. He said it was always at the tree line. Always at dusk or before dawn. Never any closer. He said he had walked to the tree line twice to look for tracks or any physical evidence of what it was. He found nothing either time. No tracks in the soft ground at the field edge. No broken branches. No signs of any kind that anything had been standing there. He said it was like whatever it was did not leave marks on the world. Like it existed in some space adjacent to the physical. He did not say that last part like a man trying to sound dramatic. He said it the way a practical farmer describes a problem he cannot solve with any tool he owns, flatly and with a kind of frustrated acceptance. I told him to come stay with me for a while. He said he could not leave the animals. I told him I was serious. He looked at me with that look he had, that patient, slightly amused look, and he said the farm was the safest place in the world. I drove home that evening and the image of that shadow at the tree line sat behind my eyes the entire 4-hour drive, dark and still and patient, like something that had all the time there was. 2 weeks later, Marcus called me at 6 in the morning. I knew before I answered. I do not know how to explain that knowing. I just knew the way, sometimes when the phone rings that the world on the other side of the call is going to be different from the world on this side of it. It was my father on the line, not Marcus. My father, who was 74 years old and had not cried in front of me since my mother died, and who was crying now in the particular devastating way of a man who has run completely out of other options. He told me Marcus had gone out before dawn to check the livestock. He told me about the boots. He told me the animals were making that sound Marcus had described to me, that low sound below mooing, and that they were all pressed against the south wall of the barn and would not move. He told me the sheriff was already there. I drove 4 hours in a state that I can only describe as a kind of terrifying, suspended clarity, where every detail of the road and the sky and the other cars was perfectly sharp and vivid and completely unreal, like driving through a photograph of a world rather than the world itself. I got to the farm at just past 10 in the morning. There were 2 sheriff's vehicles parked in the lane. The sky was the color of dirty concrete, and there was a thin, cold wind moving across the fields that carried something in it. A smell I could not identify, something between soil and something else, something older than soil. I parked and walked to the barn. The boots were still there. The sheriff had asked my father not to move them. They sat side by side in the mud just to the right of the barn door. Marcus' work boots, the ones he had worn every day for the past 2 winters, laces still loosely tied from the morning before. Side by side, toes pointing outward toward the field, like a man had stopped at the barn door, removed his boots with some care, set them down, and stepped out into the cold November mud in his sock feet and walked away. No footprints beyond the boots. That is what the sheriff told me when I asked. The mud around the barn door was soft enough to hold clear impressions. The boots made clear impressions. There were no other prints. Whatever direction Marcus had gone from that spot, he had not walked there in any way that left a mark on the ground. I spent the next 3 days on that farm while the search went on. Search teams covered the fields and the wood line and the creek bottom to the south, dogs and volunteers, and eventually a helicopter doing grid passes over the whole area. They found nothing, not a single thing. No clothing, no indication of any direction of travel. No evidence that Marcus Briggs had moved from the spot where his boots stood in the mud in any direction at all. The search coordinator told me on the 3rd evening that in his 22 years of conducting searches he had never worked a disappearance that produced so little physical evidence. He said it in a careful, professional way, but his eyes said something else. His eyes said that he was a man doing his best to hold a rational framework around something that kept sliding out of it. On the 2nd night I could not sleep. I lay in Marcus' bed in the room he had slept in since childhood, and I listened to the farm in the dark, and the farm was wrong in every way a familiar place can be wrong. The sounds were wrong, not absent, the way they had been in the Clearfield woods I have heard others describe. Just wrong. The wind moved across the fields with a sound that was slightly too regular, too rhythmic, like breathing. The cattle in the barn made their low, aching sound in irregular bursts that seemed to respond to things I could not hear. And sometime around 3 in the morning I heard something outside the bedroom window. My bedroom, Marcus' room, faced the east field. I lay in the dark and I listened, and the sound I heard was footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps in the mud directly below the window, moving from south to north along the side of the house. I lay absolutely still and I did not breathe, and I listened to those footsteps move the full length of the house and then stop. Just stop, cleanly, at the northeast corner, the corner closest to the east field, closest to the tree line 400 yards away. Then silence. I got up. I want to say I did it without fear, but that would be a lie. I got up out of that bed with every nerve in my body firing, and I went to the window and I looked out. The east field was dark in the way that field had always been dark. That particular quality of rural Pennsylvania darkness that is not just the absence of light. There was nothing visible below the window. No figure, no shape. The mud below the window, when I looked at it in the thin light from the yard lamp at the far side of the house, showed no impressions. No footprints. Nothing. But the sound had been real. I know the difference between a sound I have dreamed and a sound I have heard, and those footsteps were as real as anything I have ever experienced in my conscious life. I found the mark the next morning. In daylight, in the cold, clear air of an early November morning, I walked the perimeter of the house looking for any evidence of what had walked outside my window. I found no tracks anywhere, but at the northeast corner of the house, at the exact spot where the footsteps had stopped, I found something pressed into the wooden siding of the house about 3 feet off the ground. Not carved, not painted, pressed, as if by something warm applied to the wood with significant force. The shape was roughly circular, about the size of a large hand spread flat, and within the circle were radiating lines that made it look almost like a sun, or almost like an eye, or almost like something for which the eye and the sun are both only approximations. I touched it. The wood around the impression was cold. The impression itself was warm. In 38-degree November air, that small section of wooden siding was warm to the touch. I took photographs. I showed them to the sheriff. He looked at them for a long time and said he was not sure what he was looking at. He sent a deputy to photograph it officially. The deputy came back inside and said the impression was gone. I walked out to the corner of the house with the deputy and the impression was not there. The sighting was cold and smooth and unmarked. I checked my phone. The photographs I had taken were still there. Clear, sharp, unmistakable. The impression was real. And then it was not. My father asked me to stay on the farm. I could not. I am not proud of that, but I could not stay on that farm. Something in me that was older than reason and more honest than courage refused to spend another night in that house with the east field outside the window and the tree line 400 yards beyond it and whatever stood at that tree line in the hours before dawn. I told my father I would come back on weekends. I have kept that promise imperfectly. Some weekends I make it. Some weekends I get to the county line and I find a reason to turn around. Marcus has never been found. The case is technically still open. The sheriff calls my father twice a year. There is nothing new to report. There is never anything new to report, because whatever the land in that county does with what it takes, it does not leave evidence behind. It does not leave tracks or marks or trails. It leaves only the absence, clean and total, of the person who was there before. My father still runs the farm. He is 77 now. He still goes to the barn before dawn every morning, which terrifies me in a way I cannot put into words, though when I have tried to talk to him about it, he looks at me with an expression I have come to understand over time. It is not stubbornness. It is not denial. It is the expression of a man who has decided that if the land wants him, it knows where he is, and he is not going to spend whatever time he has left hiding from a thing that patient. I do not fully disagree with that position, but it keeps me awake on the weekends I do not make it out there, which is most of them now. There is one more thing I have not told anyone until this moment. On the morning I left the farm, the morning after the footsteps outside the window, I walked out to the east field at first light. I do not know exactly why. Something pulled me out there. Some need to look at the tree line in daylight, to see it for what it was. A line of ordinary trees at the edge of an ordinary harvested field in an ordinary Pennsylvania county. And to let that ordinary daylight reality push back against the dark weight of the previous 3 days. I stood at the edge of the field and I looked at the tree line. In the gray early light, the trees were just trees, dark trunks and bare branches against a pale sky. Nothing moving, nothing watching, nothing there. I stood there for several minutes and I felt, for the first time since I had gotten that phone call, something approaching calm. Then I looked down at the ground in front of me. At the edge of the field, in the soft bare soil, there were footprints. Socked feet, no boots. They came from behind me, from the direction of the barn, and they crossed the field toward the tree line, and they went all the way to the tree line, and they stopped at the tree line, and they did not come back. The soil at the tree line was undisturbed. No prints entering the trees. The trail simply ended at the edge of the woods the way a sentence ends when a period comes down. I stood there looking at those footprints for a long time. I thought about Marcus standing in this same field at sunset, looking at the same tree line, feeling the peace I could never feel on this land. I thought about what he had said, that the farm was the safest place in the world, that he would die there. The land in rural Pennsylvania keeps what it takes. I know that now in a way that lives in my chest and does not leave. And sometimes, on the nights when sleep will not come and the darkness outside my window has that particular quality, that watching quality, I think about my brother in those final seconds at the barn door, setting his boots down carefully, stepping out into the cold mud in his socked feet, and walking toward the tree line with a calm I will never understand. And I wonder if he was afraid, and I wonder if, in some way I do not have the language to hold, he was not. That is the most terrifying thought I carry. Not that something in the darkness took my brother against his will, but that the land he loved his entire life simply called him home in the end, and that some part of him, the deepest and most honest part, recognized the voice.